It's International Fight Week with Fight Night Picks, one big-time card with 2 titles on the line, a lot of fights to go over. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it. And just like that, we are back with Fight Night Picks and getting set for UFC 290. That one headlined by Alexander Volkanovski taking on Yair Rodriguez. As always, one half of your hosting duo, Craig Allen, Twitter and Instagram at Craig Allen FNP. With me to my left, to your right, respective socials, Matt Allen FNP. And Matt, if you follow us on Twitter, rate limit exceeded most likely.
All day long.
You know that, listen, I put myself out there a few weeks ago before I even did any of the tape study about the Elvis Brenner fight against Guram Tataladze. And I said if Elvis Brenner was able to beat Guram, I would dye my hair blue. I didn't think it was going to happen, so I'm going to do the intro.
Those virgin flights in outer space could probably see you right now.
I'm going to try and wash this out as best I can, but I'm getting excited for this because Yair Rodriguez has an opportunity to do something that hasn't been done since Max Holloway beat way back Anthony Pettis. Then he was able to parlay that forward into a long run at featherweight, and that is trying to unify the featherweight championship. And Rodriguez off that win in the co-main event, UFC 284.
Exactly.
Volkanovski off the fight against Islam Makhachev. That is your main event, the featherweight title fight. The co-main event, I mean, first new blood in a title fight, a real title fight at flyweight since Brandon Moreno fought Deiveson Figueiredo back at UFC 255. Moreno had his quadrilogy against Figueiredo, 2-1-1. He is there. But you'd think, okay, new bloods and feuds and rivalries are out of the way. He gets to fight Alexandre Pantoja for a third time. Pantoja victorious on The Ultimate Fighter Season 24. Got the second round rear naked choke finish. But if you watch that fight, it is an absolute all-timer. And then their second fight, knocking Brandon Moreno back to the regional scene, picking up a giant win, 10-8 first round there in that matchup for Pantoja. A lot of debuts on this card, a lot of short notice fights, and a lot of second times out. We have 9 ranked fighters as well. I know you're really amped up for this one.
I think both of the title fights at the top of this card, yeah, your hair slightly distracting, could easily be their own pay-per-view main events. That's how excited I am for Moreno versus Pantoja. You talk about it. They have so much history that I do think this fight's going to tell us a lot about not only this division, but the future of it too, because Brandon Moreno has been at the top of the mountain, maybe not consistently, because that rivalry has been so long going, but if he is able to beat Pantoja, I'll be curious to see if he does stay around the division, because he has beat a lot of guys. He's a big guy at 125, but Pantoja's been the guy who's been hiding in the dark, right? He's had big fights, but he's never really had that one main event so he can break through. But I think this matchup against Brandon Moreno, it's already proven for fireworks in the past. I don't see how this third fight won't be incredible.
And on a couple of weeks' notice, and we're talking really short notice, The Ultimate Fighter Season 24 is going to dominate a lot of the talks, but Terrence Mitchell coming in, and he gets a great shot at 135. Edgar Chairez in on short notice as well, and you would have thought that maybe Kevin Holland, 175 pounds, he wanted that catch weight against Jack Della Maddalena. He does not get it. In steps Immortal Martial Arts and Grove City BJJ's own Josiah Harrell to challenge Jack Della Maddalena. So a lot of big time fights. A programming note, no question mark kicks this week. I'm away throughout the week and on the weekend as well, so you're going to be missing out on that when it comes to International Fight Week. I apologize for that. We have a lot of fights to talk about. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it. In 2023, flyweight is absolutely on fire. You have the title on the line in the co-main event, Moreno taking on Pantoja, and kicking off right down on the bottom of the prelims, we have Japan's Tatsuro Taira, shuffled a little bit from a few weeks ago, supposed to be taking on Cledison Rodriguez. Rodriguez is out, and in on short notice, we have the former Combate. You can see it right there, flyweight champ. It's Edgar Chairez, and if you consider this matchup, Matt, for Chairez, it's an awesome opportunity to be able to fight on a card like this with a lot of your teammates. He's an Entram gym guy. Brandon Moreno spent a lot of time there. He's kind of all over the place for his camps, but you also have Yazmin Jauregui on this card. And so
very promising prospect.
Chairez, it is a 130-pound catch weight that he's kind of found himself in. And if you look at it for Taira, unfortunate that fight from a couple of weeks ago, it shuffles out. The double weight cut always gives you a little bit of pause. We saw Jalga Shumagulov, weight cut, and then Joshua Van. So now when it comes down to this matchup, a guy that Joshua Van fought on his card, it's Edgar Chairez. And if you go down through the performances, you already recognize him from Dana White's Contender Series. He did lose to Clayton Carpenter, but If you watch the first round of that fight, he gave Clayton Carpenter everything he could handle in that first round. Chairez won the first, and the rest of the fight was very competitive. But you watch a guy like Chairez, when he's striking, he's all over the map. He can spin kick like the best of them inside of a phone booth. His hip flexibility is insane to throw.
Yeah.
Some of the kicks that he throws, but the spin back elbows as well. So Chairez definitely posed a tough test for Tatsuro Taira, one of those very highly regarded prospects in the UFC. He's not at that Shavkat level just yet. He's not at the Hamzat level just yet, but he's building a case up through the ranks of 125. And just like fellow undefeated fighter Muhammad Makayev, I mean, these guys under 25, they're absolutely lighting the world on fire.
And I'm oddly excited about this fight. Hopefully you share my enthusiasm in it, because for Tatsuro, we've talked about this a lot and how odd his card placement has been on all of these. Now, I understand, this is a massively hyped up pay-per-view, so it is a little bit difficult to push some 23-year-old in the flyweight division all of a sudden on like a main card.
All three of his fights that Taira's had in the UFC so far have either been the first fight on the prelims or the second fight on the prelims. However, it's so the Japanese audience can tune in.
That's a very good point, but I still feel like he has garnered the respect of the North American audience at this point, because he's gone out there and he's not just putting on complete performances, he's been quite dominant, and especially once he has been able to get it down to the mat. Now, what we have talked about throughout his entire UFC tenure is the improvements that he tends to be slowly making in his boxing and really just in his striking in general. He's someone who will fight from kind of an up-high approach. He does like a lot of those clinch takedowns, so I do think that that stance helps him kind of blend those two styles together. But for Edgar, I hope you appreciate this. He reminds me of a sparkler. It was recently Canada Day. You had an odd relationship with sparklers. I feel like you got burned by them every single year.
Always grab the end of them.
But that's what I mean. So you would know better than anybody. Once you light a sparkler, can you get it to stop? Not really. And for Edgar Chairez, he does fight a little bit
in water.
Oh, I guess you can put it in water, but he does fight a little bit like a sparkler. Once he gets going, it is very difficult to slow that momentum and slow that pace. And for Tatsuro, if he's not able to complete some of those takedowns and he finds himself behind those two black lines, just accepting a lot of not only the combinations, just the absurd blitzes of Edgar in this matchup, I could see him fighting from behind. And to his credit, we haven't really had to see him do that in the UFC up until this point. It's been a lot of one-way traffic. It's been a lot of get that early takedown attempt, have a lot of success grappling. So we'll be concerned to see if he's not able to, and if he's just behind the back lines, not getting any takedowns for minutes, rounds on end, I will be curious to see how he deals with just the all-out pressure of a guy like Edgar.
Well, if you only read Taira's Tapology page or Sherdog page and you didn't watch his last fight, there's a reason why I kind of mentioned the teammates at Entram Gym. One of the main teammates of Edgar Chairez is Jesus Aguilar, who's also on this card. Aguilar in the first round against Taira, that was their respective last fights. It was a leg kick from Aguilar that drops Taira. As Taira's getting up, it's a giant guillotine attempt from Aguilar, who holds it for the majority of the round. And then right at the end of the first round, Taira's able to roll it. He's able to get the submission win of his own.
To be fair, though, like Poirier got Khabib in a guillotine for a long time. I just think some of those positions are sticky positions that you can get yourself in. They're not a complete hindrance on your whole game.
He also got hit a fair bit by Carlos Candelario, but if you look at it for Taira on the regional scene with Shuto, he's a champ over there, fought at strawweight, flyweight, and at bantamweight, so a lot of experience there for Taira, but really getting it done, settling into a groove inside of the UFC. Now, when we look at a guy like Edgar Chairez, his last time out, Fury FC, 55, he's going out there, and he's taking on a decent level of competition, but if you do the deep dive on the record, all 10 of the Chairez wins are by finish. The combined opponent record, 56, 29, and 1. But, I mean, the last couple, it was a little bit chintzy.
So he's got a fifth round loss. He's got decision losses. Like, when Edgar is forced to really elongate his game and forced to become that same fighter that he is in those first initial bursts, it is really difficult for him to elongate that success.
And, I mean, with Fury, you had a pre-main event promo in cage from Brandon Moreno on Dana White's Contender Series as they're making the walk. Chairez has Moreno in his corner, and there's also Brandon Moreno in a tiny screen giving a breakdown of Edgar Chairez. So a lot of kind of support there from the champ. But my biggest part about this was, Matt, the fight that he had against Vasquez, where poor Frank Collazo, and I'll put it up there, that was the most disgusting non-finish call I've ever seen in my life. And Chairez was struggling in that fight quite a bit. Like, you could have had a few of the rounds very close, but in that, once they got to the title rounds or the championship rounds, it was that triangle choke that was synced in where the guy, Vasquez, is completely out. The referee doesn't see it. The commentators are yelling, stop the fight, stop the fight. And then he goes for an armbar, dislocates his opponent's elbow, and then finally Vasquez wakes himself up and taps out of it. It was wild to see that. Again, you can go back and watch some of the Combate fights, the UWC fights for Chairez. The tape is readily available, but again, when you boil this one down to its simplest, Chairez is a much better striker than Taira. We've seen a lot of those really nice straight shots from Taira. That big right hand that landed against Muyad that he fought over with Shuto, that was his last win before coming into the UFC. That was a great one, but he definitely has gotten better. It's a lot of body locks to trip takedowns from Taira. For Chairez, I mean, the takedown defense is a little bit chintzy. The hands, they drop pretty darn low.
And I do worry that his aggressiveness is something that can bite him in this fight. I think him being aggressive and making Tatsuro uncomfortable is a good game plan, don't get me wrong, but when he rushes his opponents and gets them up against the cage, he will be over aggressive, and there's normally a side that they can slip out on, and that's something I am concerned about, because if he is just over committing on a lot of these shots and a lot of these blitzes, you're making Tatsuro's job that much easier of closing the distance and getting it into some of those clinch positions.
So we have a look over on Tapology. Again, this fight on incredibly short notice between these two flyweights. We will consider the old fan vote. I mean, it's a surprise test it is to you. I'm going to say over under 90% Tatsuro Taira in this one.
I'll say under, but it'll be a big favorite.
It's way over. 702 total votes, 97% Taira, 82% by submission for the 3% that have Chairez, 50% by decision. Matt, is Tatsuro Taira the guy?
I think he is going to get the win. It's nothing against Chairez, and I think he can have a really successful, maybe not crazy successful career. I think he can have a really memorable one. I do think his fighting style is one of those fight of the night must-see kind of guys, but I do worry that he could kind of fall into a Marco Polo Reyes kind of category to where it is a lot of these action fights. It is a lot of one-for-ones. Again, I think his striking can make Tatsuro uncomfortable, but I do worry about how much success he can have with it. Can he make those combinations last for not only 3, 4, 5 minutes, but 6, 7, 8, carry it later into the fight? So for those reasons, I've got Tatsuro.
Chairez has some bantamweight experience on the record. He had it with UWC. He's trying to defend takedowns, grabbing the cage, and the referee's just going to slap that hand out of there. He's also had Jason Herzog as a referee in a fight that he took against Hernandez. That was that 130-pound catchweight. I'll go Tatsuro Taira, but it's probably one of the least confident picks on this card, and everybody's going to laugh at that because he's a giant prospect, but Edgar Chairez could be that guy that really just upsets the apple cart when it comes to this division because he is so powerful with these strikes, and he could catch Taira just looking in a mirror, waiting. So we'll see how this one plays out, Matt. I think it's going to be a great fight at a catch weight of 130 pounds. Both of us with Japan's Tatsuro Taira. A lot of big-time matchups on this card. You're not going to want to miss any of them. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. And he's back, the long-awaited return. It's been about 1 year and 4 months since we've seen the Jawaian Kamuela Kirk, and he's going to be taking on the former Samurai Fight House and FFC lightweight champ, Esteban Ribovics. And I know the fans are going to be excited about this fight because if you watch Kamuela Kirk fight on the regional scene, and if you watch that UFC debut against Makwan Amirkhani, Kamuela Kirk, winner, chicken dinner. And it's a deceiving 12-5 record because Kirk fought a lot of high-level opposition on his rise up into the UFC. I mean, he's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt through and through. Siege MMA's own, which is kind of that appendage, but not really, with Santino DeFranco being the head man at the gym. Kamuela Kirk's one of those guys where the offensive wrestling might not be the best. It's not bad, but it's not the best. The takedown defense might not be the best, and you saw that tested in the 2 UFC fights. But Kirk will make you pay with his strikes. He loves to throw the head kick. He can throw some really accurate combos when he decides to let the hands go. And he's one of those guys that never takes his foot off the gas. And that's kind of the strange thing about Kamuela Kirk because he does a good job of cutting the cage. He does a good job of walking down his opponents. Then he kind of waits, and then he's always loading up for the left hook to the body, so you love to see that strike, and then he likes to come up with the right. So for Kamuela Kirk, a lot of powerful strikes, but not a lot of volume on it, and he's taking on a very polished striker in Esteban Ribovics, a guy at a Killcliff FC, and listen, the head man, the Hall of Famer this week, Robbie Lawler, he's really kind of championing things for Killcliff on this card. But when you look at it for Esteban Ribovics, I mean, I'm going to read this one out. Left hook up top, right hook to the body, left hook to the body, right hook wobbles, right hook to the body, left hook to the body, overhand right. That was the 7-punch knockdown combo that Ribovics threw against Loic Radzhabov in his short notice UFC debut. And in that fight, did he get taken out on 11 of 21 attempts? Sure, but screw it. Esteban Ribovics is one of those guys that mixes it up so well. I mean, almost knocking out Virgil Hill with a body shot. Y'all must have forgot throwing those right hooks to the body.
Not almost. He did knock out Virgil Hill with a body shot.
Roy Jones did. Esteban never did, unless you're telling me something I didn't know. But when I look at a matchup like this, Matt, this is one of a few that kind of screams like low-key could be fight of the night on this card.
I try to reel myself in when I think about Esteban, because I gotta be honest, I know Dante Exum just signed a contract with the Dallas Mavericks, and no one's more excited about it than your boy over here. But I do find myself getting quite excited about all the positives in his game. You bring it up. When his boxing is complete, when he is able to throw in combination, I really do think that's the key. He's not somebody who, like a Robbie Lawler, who you bring up. It is weird. Lawler's a guy who will throw that straight left. He will throw a lot of jabs. But other than that, it is a lot of him loading up on bigger power shots. Esteban does let his combinations really speak for themselves. And I know that's a very woof way of talking about it, but it reminds me of what Dan Hardy always said. You can choose which punches are your power punches in your combinations. And I think Esteban does a good job of that. You bring it up. He goes to the head and the body very effectively, but he's not putting everything on all of his shots, and he will disguise some of his, I'm not going to call them pitter-patter shots, because I do think he is a very heavy-handed striker, don't get me wrong, but I do think he does do a good job of disguising, hey, these are my volume strikes, and these are my power strikes. What I am curious about, and I went back to this when you were talking, when Edson Barbosa fought Beneil Dariush, I know he knocked him out, it was a crazy flying knee knockout, right? Edson Barbosa beat him because he was really able to judge, okay, are these jabs that are trying to hurt me, or are these jabs that are leading to a takedown? And for Edson's credit, he was able to decipher what was what. What I'm curious about with Kamuela Kirk is, if he is in that pocket that we talk about where he does have a lot of success with his own power shots, is he going to be able to decipher what strikes of Esteban are more of those volume strikes and what ones are the power shots? Because if he's able to stand in there for an extra couple, kind of parry and block some of the more volume-centric strikes, I do think he can land his own power shots, and I do think that when I at least initially thought about this fight, I thought, oh, Esteban's going to just be like 90% success in the feet, but I don't think that's going to be the case at all. I do think Kamuela Kirk's going to have his own success in those positions.
If Kirk keeps it at kicking range, he can have a ton of success. And if you watch Kamuela Kirk on Contender Series, he lost to Billy Quarantillo after beating him in the first round handily.
He even took him down in that one.
And then slowing down in the second round and ended up getting finished in the end of it. But if you look at it for Kirk, I mean, yeah, he had tons of success in the wrestling. He had a lot of success when it came to his strikes on the feet. But the weirdest part about this fight that might kind of get brushed off is the fact that these two guys were supposed to fight back in March. It was supposed to be a lightweight contest, and Kamuela Kirk pulled out. And I'll throw up his Instagram post there because he fractured his L5 in his lower back, and he's gotten better since. But if you look over on his Instagram, a lot of grappling. He got his first stripe on his black belt, so that's pretty cool to see. But for Kirk, you worry a lot about that injury coming back into a matchup like this, especially when it comes to a lot of the grappling and a lot of that stuff that you got to go for. So, Matt, when you do consider a matchup like this, again, I mean, Ribovics is one of those guys. You saw the right hand that dropped Thomas Paul. You see him from southpaw. He loves to throw the hooks out there.
Oh, yeah.
You saw him fight not really the greatest level of competition on the regional scene. The one really good guy that he did fight was Javier Basurto, and he also fought a really good guy in Jose Zaruz, who was 21-6-1, and it was a legit 21-6-1. I looked through it, but for Ribovics, a very fun prospect. He is almost a 2-1 favorite in the matchup. So we have a look at the Tapology vote. That gives us kind of a bit of a litmus test on what the fans are thinking out there on Tapology. I'm going to say over under 70% for Ribovics.
I think they'll be over.
I think they're going to be over. They are over. 964 total votes. 84% Ribovics. 71% by knockout with the 17% that have Kamuela Kirk. 66% by decision. Matt, I mean, Kamuela Kirk was in the same spot when he fought Makwan Amirkhani. And if you look on MMA decisions, 13-1 scored at 29-28 Amirkhani in that one. I was on the lone island going with Kamuela Kirk and being happy with the win. When it comes down to a matchup like this, I have a little bit of a harder time with Kirk taking all that time off, coming up a lightweight and having the injury. And for a guy like Ribovics, he could struggle in some of these grappling exchanges against Kirk.
He definitely could, but I do think he's going to make him pay for those grappling exchanges before they even happen. I do favor Ribovics with some of his hand speed, and I do think that's going to be a real big key. If he can get it into it, like you bring it up, if he's stuck at kickboxing range for the majority of this fight, if he finds himself missing a lot in the open octagon, he is going to be an absolute poster for a lot of counters as he's moving forward. But if he can keep it more of a stationary fight, keep his feet planted on the inside, I think he can have a lot of success in those boxing boxing combinations.
A big-time takedown, so got it done for Damon Jackson. Old Action Jackson. The last time out, and then he ended up getting the submission win. Matt, I do have Esteban Ribovics in the matchup. I think that boxing, so crisp, so clean. I think it'll get him the win. Both of us going with Argentina's Ribovics. Matt, Argentinian MMA. You got Ponzinibbio, you got Eileen Perez, you got, who else is
pretty
there?
hot right now compared to what it was 7
Laureano
years ago.
Staropoli. There's not really a lot of great fighters out of Argentina, so it's kind of a shot in the dark. Some big-time fights coming up this weekend, including the 2 title fights up at the top. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. Fiery flyweights tango in Vegas coming up this weekend with 20 finishes between them. That's losses, not wins. We have the Turkish Delight Shannon Ross taking on Jesus Aguilar out of Entram Gym. So you got Edgar Chairez, Yazmin, Jauregui, Brandon Moreno, and Jesus Aguilar. The gym really putting themselves on the map on this big time card. And when you look at this matchup, Matt, both of these guys, they fought on Dana White's Contender Series. One of them won. One of them got finished and dropped 3 times and ruptured his appendix and got blood poisoning after he fought.
That's a lot of bad stuff to happen in one
It's
night.
a lot of bad stuff. Now, you don't get over 33-year-old fighters at flyweight very often making UFC debuts, but Shannon Ross is an exception to that rule. His last win was on your birthday in 2020, Matt. November
27,
2020. That was Shannon Ross's last win, but if you look at it for Ross, he fought a lot of notable names on the regional scene.
Definitely.
He lost his eternal flyweight championship to Steven Erceg. A right hand got dropped, and then on the ground, Erceg gonna do Erceg things, and he got the submission win. If you look at it, he also had a win over Charlie, and I want to make sure that I get this right, Alaniz, who was on the Ultimate Fighter Season 24 with Terrence Mitchell, Alexandre Pantoja, and Brandon Moreno. So a good win there for Ross. He has a loss at bantamweight against Ashkan Mokhtarian. That obviously doesn't look great, but Mokhtarian did look a weight class bigger.
Is it fair to say this, though, and you've kind of tiptoed around it, but I'll just get to the point. Do you worry that Shannon Ross did spare a little bit too much of himself on the regional scene with his fighting style? Because we have noticed the consequences of that in the UFC up until that point.
I understand the story, and I'll float some of those pictures up there. He was a mechanic before he came into the UFC, a father of 4. He trains out of, Queensland, so that's pretty cool to see, but for Shannon Ross, I mean, in his fight against Cletus Rodriguez, who came in at 127 and had that Mokhtarian vibe. He looked so much bigger than Ross. He walked across the cage. He had no respect for Shannon Ross, who landed a leg kick, and that was it. Landed that big right hand, and he ends up getting the win over Ross. Now, Jesus Aguilar isn't like that because Dana White was excited about Aguilar after Aguilar won on Contender Series because he said, well, this guy's got all the submission wins and he's a good wrestler. I didn't know he threw hammers. If you watched Aguilar fight on the regional scene, all Aguilar did was throw hammers. Exactly. So it's one of those weird styles to where Aguilar, he's going to be one of the smaller flyweights you're ever going to find in terms of reach, in terms of height. He obviously comes out of a great gym, but he is like a dog on a bone with his wrestling. And if you go back and you watch his kind of Combate Fight Night main event that he had, in that one, I mean, it's just from the jump against Barraza, takedown after takedown after takedown, even into the 3rd round, and he will really chain things together. And if he's on the feet, he could definitely get countered with body kicks, he could get countered with hooks as well, but he just continues to go for those takedowns and be really, really aggressive.
And what I will say about Aguilar, too, is I think he throws pretty good feints on the outside. Now, his striking is accentuated quite a bit when he is able to implement his own wrestling, like you bring up, because the wrestling really is at the forefront of the game, whereas the striking will be more secondary to it, but I don't think his strikes are terrible by any means. The one thing I do worry about, though, is he likes to feint strikes, duck, and then throw some of his own power shots, and if he is able to work his way up the ranks, listen, I know he's not going to fight Pantoja after this, right? But you understand what I mean. There's some really good fighters in the flyweight division who can make you pay for some of those maybe just shortcomings with your game, and that's the one thing I'm worried about with Jesus watching the film. He is a little bit predictable with some of his strikes to where it's a lot of feint, and immediately after the feint, he will duck and throw a lot of strikes. So that's just one thing I do worry about when you're fighting a guy like Ross, who, yes, we bring it up. He has been susceptible to the power shot in the past, and if Aguilar can get his respect on the feet, then that's just going to open up his own wrestling that much more. But that's one thing I have noticed about Jesus is he does like to throw those feints and then throw his power shot.
And when it comes to the fight IQ portion of things, that main event that he had against Barraza, I said he won. I said he's super aggressive. In the 3rd round, he gets the action up against the cage, and then he almost pulls guard, and Barraza ends up in top position, and he's there for the majority of the round. So I had that one in 29-28. Aguilar then ends up on Dana Dana White's Contender Series. He fights the striker, Erison Fajeda, who had to weigh in twice on that one, who tired after the first round as it went on. Aguilar gets that big finish, and Aguilar's last fight was against Tatsuro Taira. Lands that crazy leg kick. It kind of wobbles one Taira. He then goes in for the guillotine, does Aguilar, doesn't get it, and at the end of the first round, that's when Taira gets the finish. But again, that's one of the top prospects that you have in all of the UFC right now. So if you look at it for Aguilar in a matchup against Ross, well, Ross, he has good takedowns of his own. He has a nice 1-2. He'll zip in a little bit of a hook there. Really good kickboxing you'll see out of Ross. Good offensive wrestling. The takedown defense, it might not be the best, but when you look at a fight like this for Aguilar's in the UFC, might surprise some people. 3-8's the total record. And if you look at the two most prominent Aguilars, Kevin Aguilar, yeah, he went 2-4. What about the one that everybody remembers?
The Jag?
The Jag. She went 1-4 in the UFC.
Was it that bad of a run?
Yeah, because she was a champ outside
I
UFC.
get it. My mind's eye remembered that a lot better than what it really was.
You don't think of her outside of the UFC. When you look at a matchup like this, Matt, Jesus looking to kind of pull that together for the Aguilars. He is a pretty big favorite in the matchup. We have a look at the Topology vote. Surprise us there to you. Fans are wilding out there today, Matt. I'm going to say over under 85% Aguilar.
I'll say over. You're right. They're wild.
They are. Look at that. 1,000 on the nose. Total votes, 91% Aguilar, 65% by submission. For the 9% that have Ross, 69% by decision. Matt, this has been the year of the underdog getting a win. And Shannon Ross is one of those guys that he moves a lot on the outside, but when it comes to the actual striking exchanges, both of these guys do the same thing. They move quite a bit on the outside. When they're struck against and forced to defend, they back up with their head back, no pullback on the head back, and then they just wait, and then finally they'll plant their feet and they'll look to counter. So both of these guys could have issue with the advancing party. I like Aguilar with the takedowns, kind of dog on a bone type of fight that he does have in him, and I will go with Aguilar.
Well, the takedowns too are another way for him to force the fight forwards, and I agree with you 100%. Whoever's moving forwards in this matchup is probably going to be the one winning the majority of it, because if Aguilar is able to force Ross up against the cage with his wrestling, or at least with some of the clinch and the threat of the wrestling, it's going to help his striking that much more in the matchup. And for those reasons, that's why I have Aguilar.
Some big time matchups on this card, especially at flyweight in this one. Both of us going with Jesus Aguilar to get the win. We'll see if his teammate Brandon Moreno can get it done in the co-main event. He's taking on Alexandre Pantoja. You're not going to want to miss any of it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. Bantamweight squaring off on short notice at T-Mobile Arena this weekend. We have a known commodity, a guy that fought on The Ultimate Fighter Season 24 after Brandon Moreno and Alexandre Pantoja in the first episode in on short notice. It's Terrence Mitchell, the former Alaska FC champ. He was on Dana White's Looking for a Fight. Was it his fault that Nick the Tooth got kicked off that show? Probably not, but it was that show where Matt Serra and Nick the Tooth get into that grappling exchange. So if you look at it for Terrence Mitchell, he gets this opportunity replacing Christian Rodriguez on a few weeks' notice. And if you look at it for Cameron Saaiman, I mean, the nickname, it's MSP. It's safely described on UFC.com as the most savage player, but one commenter on our last Saaiman video described in great detail what that nickname actually means in Afrikaans, and it's not meant for television. Wow. So if you consider for Cameron Saaiman, what do I know about him? Well, when he was on the regional scene, he was very, very good. And he comes out of Team CIT with Dricus Du Plessis fighting Robert Whittaker on this card. But if you consider for the much younger Cameron Saaiman at just 22, he's in a class of prospects that I have a hard time defining. So I wrote down a few examples that I have of guys like Cameron Saaiman in the UFC. Fire, Francis Marshall. Just picked up his first loss, but Francis Marshall. Jake Hadley, also an EFC vet, just like one Cameron Saaiman, as well as Melzik Bogdasarian. And Bogdasarian doesn't get it done like those other men, but those guys, they all have shiny records. They're all very, very good at what they do, but they all struggle in certain other areas. And for Cameron Saaiman, he is 2-0 in the UFC. He's withstood a ton of adversity in those two fights, and his fingers, knees, and toes have been magnets for illegal shots. I mean, he lost a point against Steven Kozlo. Illegal knee to the head. They let Kozlo continue in that fight. That ends up being to his detriment, and you have Saaiman getting the win. His last time out there, he lands at the end of the fight. It's an eye poke. He ends up losing a point in that one as well. So for Cameron Saaiman, that's the reason behind his majority decision win his last time out. But
But
the
also,
poor guy's got to stop just getting those fouls out there.
he does. That has been a really big issue for him. I don't disagree with you whatsoever. But he's in a class of prospect that I also have a hard time with, and this is why. He has a pretty good foundation to his game right now, and if he maintains his skill set, I do think he's going to be able to continue to get wins. But I'm curious to see what one skill he is going to try to branch out with and really try to specialize.
This is why I don't think he will, because he started kickboxing at 12, but if you look at his MMA record, he kicked off his amateur career at 14. So I think he's going to be one of those hybrid, new age, good at everything. Wrestling's the hallmark, but what you see is kind of what you get out of Saaiman. But again, he's only 22, so he's probably going to refine a few things.
Well, the other thing about that, too, is when we see fighters like that, the defense normally comes with a lot of experience. And for Cameron Saaiman, you bring it up, the record might be very nice. He is 8-0 now, but he has faced a lot of adversity, especially on the feet. He's one of these strikers who Teddy Atlas says it best. When he makes a purchase, you know what he does? He sticks around for the receipt. He doesn't say, no, thank you, I'm all good. And that's been a big issue for him because he'll get into the pocket. He has very nice straight shots. He has good combinations. The knees are really good, too. I like those as a deterrent for his opponent's takedown attempts, but the problem is, if you are like a Chad Mendes type striker, and I know those types of fighters don't come around all that often, but if there is a fighter out there who's going to be able to really threaten his takedown defense and then force him to eat strikes as a result, I just don't know if his style's one. I just think a fighter like that's going to take him a couple years to build towards, because you're right, if he does maintain his well-roundedness, and I do think it'll be an asset in the future, it's going to take him a little while, I do think, to really become a full-fledged prospect, because at only 22 years of age, I do like where he's at right now, but I think he's got a little ways to grow, because at 135, we talk about it. Is bantamweight the best division in the UFC? Arguably so, and it's a really deep one too. So for Cameron Saaiman, if you guys have watched any of our videos, you know I have been quite high on him in the past, but I think the Mana Martinez fight, maybe Mana losing his fight after the UFC is maybe clouding my judgment a little bit, but Mana was able to land some good strikes. Like, he was in that fight for a little bit.
No, he wasn't. The scores in that fight, 29-26, 28-28, 28-27. Saaiman loses a point due to 2 cup checks, and then in the third round, he lands the eye poke. He does not lose a point for the eye poke, but he does lose a point for the cup checks. And in the third round, you had 2 judges, Matt.
Oh, he was dominant in the third.
Adelaide Bird and Chris Lee scored that one 10-8 in the third round. Good cards there. But for Cameron Saaiman, what do we know? Again, that Joshua and Kim fight, he did get touched up in the first round. He rallied in the second. In the third, he gets the finish. He tends to build as these fights go along, and he forces that pressure onto his opponents. And when you look at a guy like Terrence Mitchell, who came in to the Ultimate Fighter, 7-fight win streak. Dana White's looking for a fight. And from looking for a fight, then he ends up on the show. And that was Tournament of Champions. Everybody was a champ from a regional organization. So Terrence Mitchell in that fight gets to take on the Australian Kai Kara France. Now, on Facebook, 2.9 million views. On YouTube, from a random account with just the highlight, 5.3 million views of Terrence Mitchell mean mugging and putting his fist in Kai Kara France's face in the face-off, only for Terrence Mitchell to get absolutely bodied in 30 seconds. And if you go back and watch that fight, it's just 2 overhand rights that wobble him the first time. Then it's an overhand left that drops him. Then Terrence Mitchell gets right back up, overhand right. Good night, Irene, as Michael Chavello would say. I don't know if he has that trademark, so we got to throw that out there. But Terrence Mitchell, he loses that fight on the Ultimate Fighter in 2016. Now, people are going to say in the co-main event, well, Moreno and Pantoja, that's not a real 2-0, brother, because that one fight was just an exhibition fight. I watched Terrence Mitchell get knocked out, and so did millions of other people. So he took about a year and a half layoff. So 2016 to 2018, he gets a win in 2018, then he takes another long layoff until 2020, and he's been active of late. But when you're fighting in Alaska in the lower weight classes, or in general, there's very few Jared Cannoniers, Justin Buchholz. There's a lot more Victor Rodriguez that we saw fight against Adrian Yanez. Terrence Mitchell has been a big fish in a small pond. Now, awesome to see him get this opportunity, because when he strikes, he lets it all hang out, and his head kicks are insane. So for Mitchell, at flyweight, I don't know how he made it at 5'10", and they had him on the Ultimate Fighter. 73 and 3/4 is the reach. He's still going to have that advantage of bantamweight. Even on short notice, he makes for an interesting
And the thing about Mitchell is, he's a tall fighter for all the great reasons we talk about tall fighters. But what's the one negative that we bring up? And you bring it up in that Kai Kara France performance. His stance with his arms is a little bit out, and looping shots get around his guard quite often. Now, I know Kai isn't, all over the UFC. Like, he really is, maybe not a one-of-one, but an extremely talented striker. I do worry about how Mitchell's going to handle a lot of pressure, especially in this matchup, because if he does find himself leaning back a lot, Luke Rockhold kind of wrote the blueprint for this. Sorry, it doesn't necessarily always work out well. And with Mitchell, I worry if he is worried about the takedown with his hands down, is that going to open up his striking defense that much more?
I don't think he's afraid of anything because in his last walkout, he took on 4-1 Christian Alexander. And if you want to watch that fight, it's on the XXX-itis network. I felt disgusting for watching that on YouTube. He's walking out to cult of personality in these like he's Chick Magnet Punk. Wow. So good on Terrence Mitchell. But his last number of wins, if you go back down through it from the Ultimate Fighter to now, the last few arm triangle, rear naked choke, he's got a DQ. The Justin Cook fight was a rear naked choke. And they're no hook rear naked choke wins, kind of similar to AJ Dobson when he was on his way into Contender Series and then the UFC. So if you do look at a matchup like this, Matt, Mitchell can flow through a lot of grappling positions. He has one giant advantage. Being that length and that height, you can get out of some of those sticky positions once you're down against the mat. But if you look at it, Saaiman is a pretty darn big favorite in the fight. We have a look over in Topology. The fans are crazy this week. Or they
really have it one side.
They're all in unison. I'm going to say over under 92.5% Cameron Saaiman. I'm testing them now.
I'm going to sound crazy, but over.
And it's under. Look at that. 850 total votes, 90% going with Cameron Saaiman. Large percentage of them going to win by knockout. For Mitchell, the 10% that have him to get the win, 38% by submission. And I think Cameron Saaiman can get a win in this matchup. But Terrence Mitchell is going to be tricky for a couple of reasons. Level competition on the regional scene, so bad. So bad. He was the 8th ranked flyweight on that season of The Ultimate Fighter. Brandon Moreno, number 16. So crazy to see that. But for Mitchell, since then, I've seen him add a little bit. You look at him training up there in Alaska with his brother, who's also a fighter, and one's got a little bit of the beard. One usually keeps it clean shaven. That's how I tell the difference between the two of them in their pictures. Maybe people have an issue with Matt and I sometimes that way, but Terrence Mitchell and his brother kind of look similar, like they're brothers or something. So I do like the long-range attacks of a guy like Terrence Mitchell too, especially in the first round. But for me, I like MSP to get the win in the fight.
If Terrence Mitchell fights like Cowboy Cerrone when he fought Eddie Alvarez, I think he can go out there and get a win. I think those check knees up the middle are going to be really important because they're going to allow him to create some of that distance so he can be effective with his striking. But the issue is, I kind of played my hand early, I do think the pressure of Saaiman, especially with the threat of the takedown, is going to be difficult for Mitchell to decipher because Saaiman has the ability to decide or to dictate, hey, we're fighting on the feet now, we're fighting on the ground, and for that reason, I have Cameron.
Joseph Benavidez, after Terrence Mitchell lost the Kai Kara France, everybody in the locker room's really sad. It's the end of episode 1, and Joey B grabs the mic and he says this: "It's just the beginning." And for Terrence Mitchell, just the beginning. A big-time opportunity this weekend. Somebody listening in their car to the podcast just got freaked out. But both of us going with South Africa's Cameron Saaiman to get the win. Will his teammate Dricus du Plessis be able to get it done against Robert Whittaker later on the card? We're going to find out. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. This weekend, something special's happening. UFC 290, Marcin Prachnio putting butts in seats, looking to do the impossible. Snatch the O from Vitor Petrino. Matt, you have a saying around here with Fight Night Picks about these type of fights and maybe canceling plans. What do you talk about when you say that?
Nobody's ever canceled their Saturday plans because Marcin Prachnio is about to fight. Like, honey, sorry, I know we got dinner reservations. I know you want to go see Barbie followed by Oppenheimer, but listen, Victor Petrino's fight Marcin Prachnio.
Double feature. I'm going to put it to the test. I'm going to ask my wife if she's excited about the Marcin Prachnio match on the weekend. All right, so this is a test. There's a big light heavyweight fight coming up this weekend. Petrino's taking on Marcin Prachnio. We're going to put it to the test. I know exactly what Matt's going to say in this video, so let's give it a go. I mean, follow me. We're going to leave the office. The dishwasher's going. We're going to go a little impromptu. Okay, coming up this weekend, big pay-per-view fight. Vitor Petrino is fighting Marcin Prachnio. Will you be watching?
No.
Okay. Well, maybe if I showed her the one championship highlights, maybe that would get her excited. But if you watch Marcin Prachnio when he fought with one championship, I don't know why they let the guy go, really. I mean, he's kind of like a Muin Gafurov. Muin, 3-3 over there, but against really good competition. Well, those are the losses. And then he becomes the great with the LFA. He's in the UFC now. For a guy like Marcin Prachnio, comes in off that win against just an absolute man mountain of Georgia. Stanho didn't have the nickname. Looked like a human human gummy bear of muscles. It was Gilberto Galvao. And in that matchup, I mean, Marcin landing those kicks. Marcin making it count. Marcin marches into the UFC as a favorite against Sam Alvey, and then he marches across the cage like he's got the biggest grocery bags you've ever seen. Hands down, walks into a hook from Sam Alvey, and smiling Sam, it's over. So Prachnio picks up the pieces. He loses to Magomed Ankalaev, who I wish his fight wasn't a draw against Blachowicz at 282. But if you look at it for Prachnio, it's been really weird. He then goes out and gets finished by slow Mike Rodriguez. Half of the guys that got beat by Mike Rodriguez in the UFC, you're looking at one of them in Prachnio. But the resolve out of this guy and the fact that they kept him around the promotion, it really is nice to see. I mean, you look at the recent string of wins. He fought William Knight his last time out. Knight didn't seem all that interested in fighting in that one. And I have the striking numbers.
It was hard to take a lot from that fight because Knight was just
79 to 8 were the significant strikes. William Knight went 8 of 33 on strike attempts. He threw 3 significant strikes that landed in the first round, 1 in the second round, and 4 in the third round.
Isn't it wild that we almost saw the evolution of Prachnio in that Khalil Roundtree fight? It was like, oh, we're the more of the same, right? He's getting hurt by big shots. This fight's going to be over. But he didn't stay down. That was the difference. Like, he kept on getting up, and we didn't see that result that he had, and he was able to keep the fight at range in some portions. Now, I thought of a fun name. Hopefully you'll appreciate this. Carlo Pedersoli was a guy who fought in the UFC, and he liked to use his footwork. He would throw a lot of, I would say, much stiffer kicks, but he was a guy who liked to use a lot of his range, and we never really saw the best version of him in the UFC. For Prachnio, they're not mirrors of each other, but when he is at his best, it's not when he is moving forward, kind of being that meathead that we saw in the Sam Alvey fight. It's when he is really letting his strikes and his kicks flow for themselves. But he's like a weird version of Krzysztof Jotko, I guess. And this is why. Because
they're both Polish?
No. He has a lot more pop on his shots. I would say, like, his shots are more damaging when he's able to land them consistently. But the difference is, Jotko doesn't get hit by a lot of clean shots. He will use his footwork almost a little bit too much as an elusiveness and not aggressively. But for Prachnio, he is willing to stand in that pocket for the extra second. But we've seen him get caught so many times now.
And that is the tricky thing when you look at a guy like Prachnio. I mean, he was a really big underdog when he fought Khalil Roundtree. Good first round, good third round, so he ends up getting the decision win. Performance bonus against Ike Villanueva. The kicks were on point, and that's the thing about Prachnio. He's really, really tricky to try and figure out what he's going for because he'll mix the kicks to the legs, the body, and to the head. He's a black belt in Kyokushinkai Karate, and you see that out of his style. And when you consider a guy like Prachnio that fought at middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight before he came into the UFC, it's really impressive to see the package. When it's on, it really is on. And if you look at Prachnio, even in the loss that he had against PFL millionaire Felipe Lins, he was able to win a round in that, but Lins was able to, at the very end of it, get some of the takedowns and wear on Prachnio. So what does that mean for a fight like this against Vitor Petrino? Well, Prachnio training a little bit in the Netherlands for this matchup with none other than former top man over with Bellator, Costello Van Steenis, a guy who just lost to Douglas Lima, but has a win by split decision over eventual. It's coming up in September. Bellator, middleweight title challenger, Fabian Edwards. He's fighting Johnny Eblin. That's exciting stuff. But if you look at it for Prachnio, you're working your striking against Costello Van Steenis. That's awesome to see, especially for a matchup against Vitor Petrino, because this friggin' guy, you just can't get rid of him. Petrino's first pro fight, he knocks out Bolado. Then he goes to Dana White's Contender Series against, right now, today, as we film this video, LFA light heavyweight champ Adolfo Bolado. And in that Dana White's Contender Series 3-round main event, first round, Bolado, shorthand through the guard, it drops Vitor Petrino, and it looks like Bolado's going to win the fight. And then in the second round, Petrino comes out guns a-blazing, and he gets the win over Bolado. Petrino in his UFC debut, he ends up getting the former IMMAF champ, the wrestling champ out of Sweden, Anton Turkalj, and they grappled. And in the first round, Matt, at 2 minutes and 17 seconds when it's on the clock, did Anton Turkalj kiss Vitor Petrino on the cheek? It wasn't like Yoel Romero when he kissed Luke Rockhold, because that really happened.
It did.
It might have just been involuntary.
A phantom kiss.
I mean, we're talking about the pleasure man, Matt. But if you look at it for Vitor Petrino, his striking really won out that fight. And I know the grappling went a little 50-50. Petrino ends up getting the win and out-grappled the grappler.
Had good offensive takedown.
But the striking was on point for Petrino. The only thing that scares me a little bit when you watch these Petrino fights, and I even liked just the complete, well-rounded performance that he had over with UAE Warriors against Gatchimurad and Tigulov. He got the win over there, and he was able to get it done everywhere. But Petrino's one of those guys that big, muscled up, I made the comparison last week, and I said Bruno Fajeda's taking on Nursultan Ruzboyev.
Prachnio's a big guy for the weight class, too.
So I said Fajeda is one of those guys, no losses, all finishes. He's big, he's muscled up. Vitor Petrino is the same way. And Vitor showed me a little bit more his last time out and going 3 rounds and expending all that he needed to expend in the wrestling. But boy, oh boy, like even in the Blotto fight, halfway through the first round, he's got his hands down near his knees and he's taking a couple of breaths. He's a guy that burns hot, and it worries me even against Marcin Prachnio.
And I think more than anything, this fight for Petrino is to see just how well he can pace himself over 3 rounds, because I think the threat of the wrestling is going to be important, not the fact that he's going to go out there and just dominate Prachnio with the wrestling, but if he can put it in the back of his mind to make him more willing to move backwards and get his back up against the cage, it's going to eliminate a lot of the offense that Prachnio is able to employ himself, because we brought it up so many times now. He moves on almost like a half crescent type moon. He will switch stances to throw his kicks. He will feint a lot of his kicks.
I think that's just a crescent moon.
It is just a crescent moon. But he will feint a lot of his kicks and then, of course, use his kicks a lot. But if you get him up against the cage and pressure him, it's not going to allow him to use that dynamic movement nearly as much. And again, the thing I worry about, though, is let's say Petrino gets him down early, right? Could that be the worst thing for him? Because he will start to burn a little bit hotter. Prachnio might make him work just that extra little bit that he has to where once the fight is going down the stretch, maybe Prachnio can hit him with some shots. But I do tend to agree with what you brought up, especially with the Linz fight. We did see Linz start to get closer to Prachnio, especially as that fight progressed. So I think Petrino has not a complete game plan to follow, but can follow some of those similarities.
The low hands, they concern me. It doesn't matter really what minute of the fight. Like I said, Petrino will lower them as the first round goes on, but they're really low, and he picks power over defense against a guy like Prachnio, who, although he's lost a lot of fights by finish, defensively he's sound enough because of the movement on the outside and his kicks to the head of a guy like Petrino. Petrino's got to bring his hands up from about his thigh up to his head. That could spell disaster for a guy like Vitor Petrino. I mean, you saw that when Prachnio punched his ticket from one championship to the UFC when he beat that ball of muscle Galval. So if you look at the matchup, Petrino is a pretty big favorite. I hazard a guess that the fans think the same thing over on Topology. I'm going to say over under 85% going with Vitor Petrino.
I'll say over.
You're going to say over. It is over. 981 total votes. 88% Petrino. 75% by knockout for the 12% that are Prachnio. 65% by decision. Petrino trains with, we're talking about these PFL fighters at CM System. Petrino trains with Mateus Scheffel, who's made it close to the top of the mountain, but never the winner. Always the bridesmaid. He was also on Dana White's Contender Series. He got finished. So I do like Petrino with the overall game plan, but I do worry about him in this fight and every other one he has in the UFC.
Again, for me, it comes down to where is the fight IQ of Petrino. If he can be really technical and use his forward pressure and aggressiveness to not get hit by big shots and more just to eliminate the movement of Prachnio, I think he can get the win, and for that reason, I agree with you.
Dusty in a good way. Uppercuts from Petrino when the fight gets close, and he's one of, and like after 2020, there's rare fighters of these, Matt. Vitor Petrino will be fighting in his 3rd venue in Vegas since he made his Zufar endeavor. He fought at the Apex when he was on Dana White's Contender Series. He fought at the hotel, the Virgin Hotel there when they had the fights against Anton Turkalj. Now he's going to be at T-Mobile, so some pretty cool stuff for Petrino. Both of us have the Brazilian to get the win. Some big-time fights in this card, including an absolute flyweight showcase in the co-main event. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. It's the rematch that you didn't know you needed. No, not Anthony Smith versus Ryan Spann. It was a draw. We're talking about Jimmy Crute, who's taking on Alonzo Menifield. Second fight in as many fights, Matt, because if you go back and you watch that fight, and I'll throw the scorecards up there, these guys just had a tilly. And if you do look at it, Jimmy Crute, what did he excel in? If you had to guess, would it have been the wrestling? Yeah, it was the wrestling. Alonzo Menifield at space. Well, Jimmy Crute doesn't move his head. And he ate
a fun fight.
Many shots. He got dropped in the first round, dropped in the second round. In the third round, Crute rallied back with his wrestling. A quick grab of the fence, and all of a sudden a point was taken from Alonzo Menifield in what would have been a 29-28 decision win for Menifield ended up costing him, and it's 28-28. So now we get to reset the deck. We get to look at this fight, and overall, going back to that last one, Matt, Topology overwhelmingly had Jimmy Crute. He was the favorite in the matchup. I did not have him to win that fight, so I take some solace in the last one. However, I'm the guy that started this video out with blue hair, and you didn't. So if you do look at this matchup between these two light heavyweights knocking their way up the ladder, it's a tricky one to try and offer up thoughts, because for Jimmy Crute, I mean, we've seen him reach really, really high highs, right? Like, we saw that fight that he had against Anthony Smith. He was favored to win that fight. The leg injury cost him in that one. We've seen him just absolutely maul opponents who were hot at the time. Think of it. Go back a few years. He beat Paul Craig in dominant fashion. Jimmy Crute's one of those fighters that you have to watch out for, but the recent run has not been good, and he's not necessarily in Kevin Lee, Rinat Fakhretdinov type of territory, but for Crute, he really is behind the eight ball compared to a 35-year-old Alonzo Menifield who's on a roll, and we saw that against Ashkar Majarov. The win is what it is, but we've seen Menifield really string together some big-time wins. The losses are against some bigger competition, and if you make a case in this fight, I mean, Saikson Janjira Muay Thai, training with a guy like Chidi and Joe Kawani, that's getting you ready for fights like these, brother. So if you look at it for a guy in Alonzo Menifield, you saw him absolutely blast Crute with those shots. You saw him get taken down.
I thought he was going to stop him at the end of the first round. I really did.
So did I, especially on the rewatch. I knew what the result was, but I went, why aren't they stopping this fight? Because it was big time ground.
Credit to Crute, though, because his resolve is absurd. But the weird thing about Crute is, other than the Misha Cirkunov performance, a lot of, and I won't say his losses, but a lot of moments where his opponents have success is in the striking. And it's weird because Crute himself isn't some awful striker. Like, he has a good jab. He does have decent kicks on the outside, but it always has been a factor of when he's forced to back up on the feet, it doesn't allow him to use his kicks as much, and he's not such a good boxer to where, okay, he's like a Dustin Poirier to where he can keep on throwing the jab backing up. He really does need to use his advancing footwork to have success on the feet, and like you said, Menifield made him pay for it, especially at distance, but I was surprised. Like, in the second round, Jimmy Crute's still trying to go out there and pump the jab at some points after he has been hurt really bad in the first round. So for Crute, you'd hope that in his mind he's thinking, okay, it is nothing but takedowns in this matchup. I bring it up. I know the Cirkunov matchup, it was just one of those elongated grappling sequences where, hey, Misha Cirkunov is an absolute wizard on the mat too, but for Crute, I do think the takedowns are going to be key. And I know you bring it up that we saw it in the first fight, but I worry about Jimmy Crute and his overall durability. I feel like that's going to be a conversation I bring up on a couple of fights on this card. But at only 27 years old, like, this isn't me talking about Robbie Lawler's durability, right? A guy who's been in multiple Fight of the Years, one of the all-time great fighters. For Crute, it really has been, I don't want to say a fast downfall, because he's only lost to some really good fighters. Jamal Hill's currently the champ
and a former title challenger.
Exactly, but it is a factor of when a lot of the success to your opponent is coming in similar fashion. I worry if that's something that Crute can fix overnight, or if that's always just going to be a bit of a hole in his game.
So if you look at the respective UFC careers of both of these guys, Crute coming in off Dana White's Contender Series, got the win there in 2018, gets a contract. Menifield needed 2 performances, but 2 first-round finishes? That's kind of wild. They let anybody that has a pulse fight now.
He's like 98 Jordan on Contender Series.
Off Dana White's Contender Series. But if you look at it for Menifield, he is 6-3-1 in the UFC. And if you add things up for these guys, they've each only been an underdog combined in 1 UFC fight apiece. Alonzo Menifield was only an underdog too. Jimmy Crute was only an underdog too. Hussar, Michael Olszejczuk, where he ended up winning by, it was a performance bonus submission win in that matchup. So, again, the wrestling edge goes to Jimmy Crute. The striking edge goes to Alonzo Menifield. The 75% takedown defense for Menifield, even after all those attempts and successes that Crute had in their last matchup. And if you consider that last one again, as I said, a plus 150 for Alonzo Menifield his last time out. They're basically at par right now. People went back. They watched that fight. We're going to have a look at the fan vote. And again, Jimmy Crute commanded the lion's share the last time. I'm going to say over under 60% Crute this time.
I'll say over, but I do think it'll be close.
And it's the opposite. 1,007 total votes, 65% Menifield, 80% by knockout for the 35% that have Crute, 58% by decision. So everybody got off the train of Jimmy Crute's going to submit Alonzo Menifield. And that last fight was back in February 11th at UFC 284. A lot of 284 fighters on this card. So who do you have now?
I have a really hard time with this fight, not just because they fought to a draw, so of course they're probably pretty closely skilled, but If Crute can get Menifield down with a lot of time left in the rounds, I do think he can maybe not lead to a finish necessarily, but just have enough success to where he's avoiding the big shots. It doesn't look bad in the eyes of the judges. But I worried about Crute's durability really for a long time now. And he's been hurt by Menifield a few more times. I have a hard time with the pick, but I guess I'll jump into your side and I'll go with Alonzo Menifield.
Yeah, I mean, round one, left hook was what really got it going, and you had Jimmy Crute kind of stumble down to the mat. He got back up. A short right at the end of the round was the one that dropped him. Then there was a lot of ground and pound, and at the start of the second round, it was a short left that dropped him. But again, third round fence grab, you know the drill. I'll stick with Alonzo Menifield in the matchup. I'm sure Crute's going to go out there, maybe even a one-round game plan of, I'm taking this guy down, one hit, one kill jiu-jitsu, and it's over. And for Alonzo Menifield, you've seen him make some moves. I mean, Fortis MMA at one point, Saixon as well. So a lot of big-time parallels between these fight styles. I'm really eager to see if the drop-off from Crute is warranted in the matchup. So really want to hear from you down below in the comments section. Both of us going with Atomic Alonzo Menifield to get the win. Some big-time fights and title fights at that in the main and the co-main. Flyweight and featherweight straps on the line. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it. Gomes and Yazmin Jauregui are absolutely rolling and looking to continue their winning ways, and you have to figure with a win in a matchup like this, you either get to break into the top 15 or you're taking on that unofficial 16th ranked strawweight. A couple of big timers in this matchup. The undefeated former Combate champ that is Yazmin Jauregui. She showed the resolve her last time out, got dropped early against Estela Nunes, and then she came a knocking for hers in the second round. It was a couple of knockdowns and a big win there for Jauregui. And if you consider it, if David Onama never fought Nate Landwehr, Yazmin Jauregui and Yasmin Lucindo would have had an absolute fight of the night in that San Diego debut, just across the border from Entram Gym for Yazmin Jauregui. But you have to think again, if Jauregui wins or if D. Gomes wins, maybe some names that are out there like Karolina Kowalkiewicz or an Angela Hill or even somebody that's ranked in the top 10 but on a 2-fight losing streak that's just out there. She doesn't look good. Marina Rodriguez needs a little bit of a dance partner, so both of these women in a prime opportunity. You look at it for D. Gomes in the debut. She loses to Loma Lookmanme, and that was an odd one because they both got into some of the grappling, but Loma was able to win out in a lot of those exchanges. Gomes, her last time out, fought like we saw her when she was on the regional scene, even before Contender Series. Gomes taking on Bruna Brazil, the really polished former soccer player, but also rangy striker. D. Gomes just walks her down, lands the big shot. It drops Brazil, some crazy ground and pound. Crazy, too, that Keith Peterson was not nonsense. I don't know. It was a weird stoppage because Brazil was covering up.
A little nonsense.
There was one shot from Gomes, and then a little bit of a reset and a wait, and then one more shot, and Keith Peterson saw enough. So Gomes goes out there, gets that finish win, and really cool for her because last weekend PRVT and life partner Carol Hossa got the win over Yana Santos. So D. Gomes gets to try and look to move it forward for the team, trying to get a win against Yazmin Jauregui. And if you consider it, Gomes is more likely to go for the takedown to try and muscle things. You remember her fight against Dudieva over with Invicta, somebody that fought in the UFC, and Gomes rallied back in that fight. We've seen her rally in fights, but she just pushes forward, reckless abandon, big power shots, really nice takedowns, whereas Jauregui plays boxing from the outside and will snap the occasional leg kick out there.
I have a really hard time with this fight, and this is why.
I do too.
I think Yazmin should win this fight based on her striking. I do think she is the more complete striker based on the totality of her game, because Gomes is going to throw some wild looping hooks. If they land, credit to her. They are very powerful strikes, but she's not a fighter like a prime Jessica Andrade who's going to work her way into the pocket and then throw all those big strikes, especially to the body and to the head. But I think she has enough power to make Yazmin uncomfortable, just throwing a lot of naked strikes in the middle of the cage. And if she can somehow force Yazmin to move backwards, and that's easier said than done if you're not able to have a lot of success in the striking, because when Yazmin is able to get really in your face and throw her own combinations, There's not a lot of room to breathe. You are getting hit by a lot of different shots from different angles, too, and that's what I appreciate out of her. But what I don't like is she's a big favorite, and she does have a tendency to get hit by some of these bigger power punchers. You bring it up. In her last matchup, we saw her get tagged cleanly.
Jauregui's throwing a leg kick, and then it's a right cross that comes out from Nunes that drops Jauregui.
And that's the interesting thing. When Yazmin's just sticking to her boxing, I think she is a very difficult fighter. Maybe not to hit completely, but I think she's a lot better with her defense when she is primarily focused on the hits. I'm glad you bring it up. When she does throw some of her kicks, they are a little bit naked. They aren't necessarily set up, and that's how she can get caught.
And normally I do this type of thing in post, but I want to get the reaction of it because for Jauregui, her last time out, she's fighting on that Holland versus Thompson card, which that Cuervo ad, I mean, MMA fans probably like it, but I got tired of it after about the 5th time last weekend. This is what happened to her. She just hit a little bit of an error message, and then she popped right back up. Again, she rallied really well against Nunes, but she was a minus 325 favorite in that matchup. Now, if you look at it for Jauregui, she herself training out of Entram Gym, but also going to San Diego, not just to fight, but she's training out of 10th Planet San Diego with Manolo Hernandez, who is the main coach. You always see him with Ilima-Lei McFarlane, the former champ over with Bellator. So cool to see for Jauregui because there's a lot of great women that grapple at that gym. But again, for D. Gomes, the Andrages, the Hosas, the, who else is it? Maria Oliveira that trains at a PRBT. Maria's a bad example, but she also trains there. Again, you alluded to it, but Jauregui more than a 4-1 favorite in this one. The trouble I have is Jauregui will throw the occasional leg kick out there, but she's primarily a boxer, and we saw it work great for her when she was with Combate. She did have to fight out of some tough positions when she got backed up against, we'll call it with Combate an imaginary black line, but in the UFC's octagon, the black line where you're, just feet away from the cage. Gomes, somebody that pushes a pace, throws a lot of kicks, and is powerful with the takedown. She definitely has a good opportunity in this matchup, although the odds are swayed Jauregui's way. We have a look at the fan vote, Matt. I'm going to assume it's not close, like none of them have been. I'm going to say over under 87.5% Jauregui.
I'll say over.
And it's over. So 1,011 total votes, 91% or 94% Jauregui, 79% by decision for the 6% that have Gomes, 45% by decision. We've seen Jauregui tagged. Will we see her get tagged again?
I have her in this matchup, but I do feel like sooner rather than later we will realize the limitations. Maybe not of her skill set completely, but at least this version of it, because she's still a very young fighter, only 24 years old, is making those improvements fight in and fight out. But I do think it's going to come to, hey, she's going to get a fighter who might be that kind of half step too high up in the division for her. But guess what? A loss can sometimes be the greatest thing for your career. So I have Yazmin in this matchup, but you bring it up. I'm really curious to see who they put her in with next if she is able to get the win, because she is not only an exciting prospect, but a pretty exciting fighter, and the UFC likes to push people like that.
I mean, both these women. You have 24 and 23. If D. Gomes gets the win in this matchup, she deserves that shot as well. So I do have Jauregui in the matchup, but this is a really tough one. So let us know who we have in the comment section down below. Some big-time fights on this card, including Entram Gym's Brandon Moreno, who's taking on a tricky fighter, Alexandre Pantoja. The main event, another Mexican fighter, Yair Rodriguez, taking on Alexander Volkanovski. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. And the breaking news comes across just before we start to film on Sunday night. Matt, the Immortal Brown, on his Twitter saying that a big Ohio native will be signed to the UFC on short notice. He had the premonition, and it will be taking place. We have, on about 6 days' notice, the muscle hamster, Josiah Harrell, coming in, the former Ohio Combat League welterweight champ, looking to take on Jack Della Maddalena. And a lot of people thought it would have been Kevin Holland. He's got a fight coming up in about a month. He decided, no, well, maybe I want to catch weight at 175. That fight was out. And of course, this was originally scheduled to be Jack Della taking on Sean Brady, but it looked like a nasty staph infection on the elbow of Sean Brady. He's going to keep him out of action. So now we get this fight where it really is a clash of styles. It's orthodox versus southpaw. It's wrestler versus boxer. This is going to be one of those big time type of fights. And I know a lot of people, and you included, very excited about Jack Della in the UFC. His last time out, he beats Rude Boy Randy Brown. The time before that, I mean, he's beating Hot Chocolate Danny Roberts. The Ramazan Amin fight was wild. The win over Angelusa, who's now in the UFC on Dana White's Contender Series, that one put Della over, but a former eternal champ is Jack Della, and he started his career off on a rocky road, told his coach, 10 wins in a row, I'd be in the UFC, and sure enough, he's done it. And for as spectacular as he's looked, though, Matt, I feel like what a lot of people are going to spend time this week doing is they're going to build up Jack Della, they're going to tear down Josiah Harrell, who's getting the shot on short notice. And we went back and watched the tape, spent the $10 on...
Don't gotta tear down anybody.
Combat Sports Now to watch some of that Ohio Combat League tape on Josiah Harrell. But watching his tape, and not just the one SportsCenter highlight, showed that he's a really special athlete in his own right.
I definitely think he is, and I'm excited for his UFC career, but it's a bit of an interesting matchup going in there against a guy like Jack Della Maddalena on such short notice, because the reason I have been quite high on Maddalena throughout his UFC tenure is he was beating guys who I have a lot of respect for. Maybe they aren't the highest guys in the ranking, but beating those athletes really proves something to me, and you bring it up. The Ramazan and me fight was really impressive to me. I know he got taken down really early, but guess what? He popped right back up to his feet. He wasn't controlled for any period of time. And how did he finish that fight? He went to the body, and I do think that's been a hallmark of his game throughout his UFC tenure. I know his boxing combinations are very damaging. We saw that in the Randy Brown fight. I know he ended it by submission, but the way he was able to close that distance, get him up against the cage, and land his boxing combinations really does tell you what his blueprint is for a lot of these fights. It's to get inside and damage his opponents. But the fun comp I wanted to give to you was Jack Della Maddalena, to me, is kind of like what the other version of Emil Mech would have been in the UFC, you know? A guy who had early losses in his in his MMA career, was able to really rebuild himself on the regional scene, and then when he came over to the UFC, had very high expectations. Now, unfortunately for Emil Mech, he was never able to really reach them. He has had a good career, he had a lot of really fun fights, but for Jack Della Maddalena, we have seen him go out there and beat guys who, yes, they might not be ranked, but they are very respected fighters, and those skill sets I do think do transfer to when he is able to fight guys higher up in the division, because you bring it up. You don't go from fighting Sean Brady to just some random guy, right? Like, Sean Brady is a very respected member of the top 15. I know he has kind of reached his own limitations, but still, that would have been a massive fight at 170, so I'll be interested to see, A, if Harrell's able to win, if he can somehow pull off this massive upset, there is an absolute rocket strapped to his back. Like, he is going up the division like nobody we've ever seen.
There's a couple of things that you have to take into account, and people are going to overlook these things. We've had a number of short notice fighters come in recently and pick up giant wins. Look at last weekend, Nursultan Ruziboev, he goes out there and he's taking on Bruno Ferreira as an underdog. He wins that fight. A few weeks before that, you had Mohamed Naimov coming in against Jamie Mullarkey on short notice, big underdog, and he gets the win. And Naimov, undefeated in his own right, he was really kind of chugging along. Now you have Josiah Harrell, and if you go back and you look at some of these performances, I mean, I already mentioned it, but Matt Brown, Harrell's one of those guys that does train with Matt Brown at Immortal Martial Arts, and Mark the Hammer Coleman.
He was singing his praises on Twitter all day.
Harrell also trains at a Grove City BJJ. He's a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he also wrestled in high school. And I am not lying when I say, now listen, every region has weird names. Up here in Canada, we certainly do. I mean, what is there? Flin Flon's a real place, and you also have...
Ecum?
Yeah, Ecum Secum or Ecum Secum, but you also have Dildo, Newfoundland. So
there
real places that exist in the world.
Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia.
Josiah Harrell went to high school at Licking Heights High School, and he was a sectional and divisional wrestling champ there. He wasn't able to get it done at state, but if you watch Harrell fight, he is a southpaw. He throws really good laser-like punches. He can throw nice hooks. He will mix in a really tidy uppercut, which is something that we're going to talk about later on. Pantoja Moreno, a lot of uppercuts in that fight, or the two fights that they had. But what I really like out of Harrell is that big-time wind-up of a head kick that he has, and he catches just about every single opponent. Now, if you've looked at Harrell over kind of some of the last number of fights, his last two fights, his last fight was supposed to be 160-pound catchweight. He came in at 162. He missed weight for that one. The fight before that is at lightweight. He came in at 159.4, so a little bit of a head scratcher. Now, I know he's taking this on short notice. It's going to be at welterweight, so that should help him out a little bit.
Della Maddalena's a thick guy.
He's at a reach disadvantage and a height disadvantage to most guys at 170, unless maybe Pete Rodriguez wanted to hang around a little bit, old dead game. But if you look at it for Harrell and you go down through it, I mean, we kind of touched on it. His last time out, he burst through for a takedown attempt through the cage door with the LFA, so that was kind of crazy to see.
And he's got great speed on the takedown attempts. Now, the only criticism I will give to Harrell is there's not a lot of like jab, and then go for the takedown attempt. It is a lot of trying to close that distance very rapidly. And yes, it has worked for him, to his credit. But the problem is, up against a big guy who is quite strong, who does a good job at digging those underhooks, I think it is going to be difficult for him to get the positions, or at least get the fight into positions where he can have success. Because for as good as his striking has looked up until this point, it is a tough ask for
Yeah,
him to
no,
go out there
no,
and strike this Della
100%. But when you look at it for Della, what was the thing that he struggled with on the regional scene, making up to pro? It was a lot of the grappling and the stalling out behind the black lines. And if you watch Josiah Harrell in that last Ohio combat fight, where referee Gary Copeland, old guns himself, he was the referee. Harrell from minute 1 to the finality where he was able to get the submission win, it was open space takedowns time and time again, and that is really something that you want to look for. And he's also one of those guys, he will go a little bit submission or, finish over position, but he can also keep it steady in half guard, in guard as well. You look at the fight that he had with CFFC, Reader with the takedowns against him, and then Reader with the illegal knee where the referee, Gasper Oliver, he doesn't take the point in that one. Harrell ends up rallying big time in the second round after getting taken down. He sweeps for position, and then he ends up getting the submission win. So Josiah Harrell, undefeated, all of his wins by finish. He was undefeated, 6-0-1 as an amateur. Surely he's going to come in as a giant underdog. The fans are going to go with Jack Della Maddalena. And for the reason that I like Della Maddalena's crisp boxing, you saw it the last time out against Randy Brown where he just crumpled him, and then he ends up on the back. It was the no-hook, rear naked choke finish. That was awesome to see out of Della. But
he came out like a man possessed.
The mixture of the body work that he will do, he likes to dig that left hook to the body, and the fact that Della's going to offer you a different look from the switch stances with his boxing, and you will get opposite combinations out of the two stances. To me, it offers up a little bit too much for Harrell, but with Josiah Harrell, I think he's obviously the biggest prospect you've seen out of Ohio in some time.
And at only 24, too. That's the thing.
And secondly, he should be one of those guys that's able to carve out a pretty darn good career, whether that's at welterweight, super lightweight, or at lightweight.
This is one of those kind of bittersweet predictions, I guess, because I think Josiah Harrell is going to go on and have a quite bright future in the UFC. On short notice, though, against Della Maddalena, it's a really tough ask for anybody. I said it in the Jim Miller fight. Jim Miller's one of those guys who seems to accept a lot of these short notice opponents, right? And guess what? He goes out there and beats a lot of them, because you need a ton of experience against a lot of high-level opposition to be able to just come in on short notice and beat somebody like that. Now, I understand Della Maddalena doesn't have the experience that somebody like Jim Miller does, but he's a pretty darn good athlete in the 170-pound division, so I think he's going to get this win.
Both of us going with Jack Della Maddalena to beat the muscle hamster Josiah Harrell. If you watch some of these Harrell fights, he fights, and with the beard and the hair, he looks a little bit like Brown Bear, Devin Clark. So look out for that from Josiah Harrell. A big fight here on short notice at welterweight. Matt, we have quite a few short notice pairings at UFC 290. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it. It's UFC 290, and this week, Robbie Lawler becomes a UFC Hall of Famer in the fight wing for his title defense at UFC 189 when he took on the Canadian. It was Rory McDonald in an all-timer, and people dispute whether that's the greatest fight of all time, but what I'm not disputing is the fact that Robbie Lawler, once he eventually hangs up the gloves, he's more than likely to become a real Hall of Famer in the fighter wing.
That might not even be his most exciting fight. That's how exciting of a fighter Robbie Lawler has been throughout his whole career. There's guys that you watch who are outside the rankings, right? And you always think to yourself, I'd wonder how they'd look if they ever got some of those high-profile matchups, right? Against some of those ranked fighters. They might be a bit of a brawler. They might eat some big shots, but you just like watching them fight. Robbie Lawler is what happens when that guy somehow is able to keep on getting those wins that you might not expect him to get, keep on refining those skills, and maybe becoming a little bit less of what he once was, because Robbie Lawler is, like you had said, not only a Hall of Famer, but really is going to go down as an all-time great 170.
He debuted at 20 in the UFC when he was 4-0, taking on 17-4-1 Austin Riley, and he's coming in with a little bit of scruff. He's got the hair. Robbie Lawler. Iowa. So if you look at it for Lawler, I mean, it's been a wild run. He ends up kind of going off on a loss. He goes out there, becomes the Elite XC middleweight champ. He has a bit of a rocky road when he fought with Strikeforce, but when Lawler made that return to the UFC, I mean, yeah, really stumbled on a loss.
Josh Koscheck still checks under his bed.
Josh Koscheck, that was tough. But if you look at it for Lawler, he goes on a wild and crazy run. And I know it ended with Tyron Woodley. And if you consider that Woodley fight and everything that's been after it, it's been a lot more losses than it has been wins.
He had been in 3 straight fight of the years leading up to that, to be fair.
Yeah, he had a fight against Carlos Condit that was wild. He won his title against Johnny Hendricks in the rematch.
Wild fight.
I mean, there's just been a lot of craziness for Robbie Lawler. But again, we do have to consider this last number of fights. And he had the win against Donald Cerrone, which is a close decision. That one, of course, a welterweight fight. If you look at it against Nick Diaz, it was competitive at the start, and then Lawler started to pull away, even though the numbers show that Diaz threw a lot of strikes. But if you look at some of these losses, Dos Anjos controlled with the wrestling. Ben Askren, that was a fight that Lawler was winning until he wasn't. And then the fight against Bryan Barberena, a close enough fight until just those last few seconds in that second round when Barberena was able to pull away and get the win. The Neil Magny fight, the Covington fight, although late, Lawler looked pretty good with the striking against Covington. The wrestling won out and the grappling for Magny and for Covington. I go and I look at these last two performances from Lawler, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to say, okay, he's on the decline. I would say,
well, yeah, a 41-year-old who was in 3 straight Fight of the Years from 2015 to 18 might be on a bit of a decline.
Came into the UFC 21 years ago.
Hot take, Stephen A.
Hot take. But if you go back and you watch that Bryan Barberena fight, and I did.
He ate some big shots.
Yeah, but Robbie Lawler's rolling with those punches like he's a prime James Toney taking on like Jason Robinson. You're going up against the southpaw. And what Lawler was doing was, you saw it, a couple of those kicks starting to land lower. You saw a lot of hooks going to the body from the left side, but Lawler was working the body to come back up top. But the one thing that he didn't do like a James Toney, what did James Toney do so well when he was...
way too much. Oh, sorry.
What did James... That's just stupid. What did James
That
Toney...
was the thing about James Toney.
It doesn't matter to the fact that he was able to shoulder roll so well like Robbie Lawler was trying to do. James Toney would pivot on his lead foot, get out of the way, and land the counter shot. Robbie Lawler would stick there, not move his feet, do a lot of rolling, and then once it was time to plant, he'd plant, and then he'd eat a couple of more shots, and then he'd go for his own. That's what caused him against Bryan Barberena, or cost him against Barberena. So, still training he was a Hard Knocks guy, a Sanford guy, he's a Kill Cliff guy, he's training with the kicking machine, Jason Jackson, and you love to see it. A lot of great guys there to try and get you ready for Fight Me MMA Zone Nico Price. Florida man Nico Price.
So we've talked a lot about just the overall career of Robbie Lawler, and I think it is fair to say, listen, the guy's been in a lot of really difficult fights. I am curious to see just how many big shots he can still take in his career, especially against a guy like Nico Price, who he's not the most picturesque striker. He's not like a Yair Rodriguez, right? He'll throw kicks, he'll throw punches, but they're in a bit of a stiff manner. They're from a long distance. He won't lunge in with a lot of his strikes. I think that's going to be important too, because Robbie Lawler, this is the thing I think that's the big difference between early career and later career. He doesn't have the same pop in his hands anymore. And it's no discredit, he's 41. It'd be wild to think he is the same level of athlete he was when he had initially won the title. But Lawler, he hurt Bryan Barberena, but he wasn't able to drop him and get him out of there. And Bryan Barberena's not a guy who ever would have been on Robbie Lawler's level. And even Nick Diaz was able to land some good shots earlier on in that fight until Lawler hit him with that big shot that was able to break his nose and lead to the end of that fight. But Lawler, and the reason I do bring this up is, the last fight was the first one where I was a little bit concerned about just his overall durability in a matchup like this, because if he is getting into one of those 1-for-1 type power shots with a guy like Nico Price, I'm worried about Nico Price's susceptibility to some of these shots too, don't get me wrong, but he's still 7-8 years younger than him, and he's been in difficult fights, but not as many as a guy like Robbie Lawler, and that's what I keep on falling back to. At 29-16, he is one of the greatest fighters of all time, but a lot of those fights have been kind of all-time great fight of the night, fight of the year style fights, so I just worry about how many more of those Robbie Lawler has left in the tank, because this matchup against Nico Price is probably going to be another one of those give one to take one type matchups.
Yeah, Nico Price is 7-6 with 2 no contests in the UFC. Now he's pop, and that's why he's earned some no contests. If you look at it for him, the draw that he had against Cowboy Cerrone, that was turned to a no contest. I mean, Price came into the UFC on a Ronda Rousey card, UFC 207, and he was the last man to dispatch Brandon Thatch in the UFC. He got a win right there. Thatch was on a roll until he fought Benson Henderson, and then it was all over. But Nico Price is one of those guys, odd angle shots. He had the giant knee wraps last time out against Phil Rowe. He beat the brakes off of Phil Rowe for about 13 minutes, and then he completely gassed, and Phil Rowe overtook him and got the win. And now that win or loss ages worse because Rowe lost to Magny, because that's how MMA math works, Matt. But when you look at it for Nico Price, I mean, what does he have? An up kick win against James Vick. He's got a reverse hammer fist from bottom against Randy Brown. You always have to watch out for Nico Price. The jiu-jitsu can be kind of a part of his game.
It's good offensively, especially when he gets the back.
It is. So when you look at a match like this, Matt, you've been bullish on Robbie Lawler for a long time.
I said he was going to lose his last fight, though, and he did.
And when it comes to Nico Price, it's kind of been all over the map. Price is a pretty darn big favorite in this matchup. But again, Lawler, Hall of Famer this week. You have to think that plays into it some way. Somehow, some way. We have a look at the Topology votes. Surprise that's there to you. I'm going to say over under 75% price.
I oddly think they're going to be close, so I'll say under.
They are over. 1,147 total votes, 78% price, 27% by decision, 64% by knockout for the 22% that have Lawler, 51% by knockout, and 43% by decision. The fans see a finish in this one. Who do you have to win it?
I think there probably will be a finish just because unless Nico Price goes insane wrestle heavy, and maybe he does because you bring it up, his jiu-jitsu is a little bit underrated, maybe undervalued, I should say, because we don't see it all the time, but when he is able to get it to some of those positions, listen, I know Brandon Thatch isn't the greatest defensive grappler of all time, but again, Nico Price has that skill set in his back pocket, and for Robbie Lawler, you're going to talk about the wrestling, they're going to bring it up. Robbie Lawler doesn't shoot a ton of takedowns at this stage of his career. He's not, I would say, in the top tier of wrestlers. We saw Neil Magny have good success. We saw Colby Covington really overwhelm him with the wrestling. I favor Nico Price in this matchup, though. I think this is going to be one of those kind of all-time greats where we do see one-for-one type striking. And I just think Nico Price, not that he couldn't get stopped, but I think he's just a shade more durable at this stage of his career.
I don't love it. I'll go with Nico Price in the matchup. I think some of those long-range strikes he can have success in, but the trouble that Nico Price has in a lot of these striking exchanges, if he gets backed up, which he does, he can try and block a lot of shots with his arms, and he gets hit so bad when he defends
Luke
that
a lot
way.
Of success, yeah.
You saw Luke. You've seen a lot of different fighters do it. So both of us going with Nico Price. I do not love this pick, Matt. The Hall of Famer.
I love the fight, though.
It should be a great one. It caps off the prelims, and it gets you ready for the main card. We get some big fights coming up, including Tresean Gore and Bo Nickel. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. Big time battle of the prospects at middleweight coming up this weekend. We have the former three-time NCAA D1 champ and the 2019 Dan Hodge Wrestler of the Year. It is Bo Nickel, a 2020 Olympic hopeful, and while that didn't work out for him, my goodness, has his MMA career. He came in and dispatched old Jamie Pickett in the first round of his last matchup. Controversial knee to the groin, but Nickel was able to pull out the win, get it done by submission. It was a crazy arm triangle choke that he had to readjust a few times, but Nickel victorious in that one. He's going to be taking on what was supposed to be the Ultimate Fighter finalist in the last middleweight season, Tresean Gore, Mr. Vicious, and favored to get the win over Brian Battle. Gore is out due to a knee injury, so in steps a guy that Gore was able to finish, Gilbert Urbina. Urbina gets finished by Battle. Battle fights Gore. Gore's favored to win again, but Gore couldn't really get it going in that matchup. Didn't get out of first gear. He ends up losing the fight. He then goes out against Cody Brundage, and he gets outstruck by the wrestler. He gets finished. So Gore, you don't know what to expect anymore. All of a sudden, he's 3-0. He's hyped up, and then he's 3-2. So his last time out, he takes on Cody Brundage's teammate in Colorado, the Big Yinzer. It was Josh Fremd, a guy who wrestled at, and I want to make sure that I get this one right, Slippery Rock University. The university that Matt Adams went to, Washington Nationals legend.
Wow.
St. Louis Cardinals legend. And Tresean Gore goes out there and puts together one of the most disgusting guillotines I've ever seen in my entire life. Impressive. It goes up there with Manuel Torres and Cañada that he had on the regional scene. That one was disgusting, but Tresean Gore popped the head off of Daisy, so now he's in a matchup like this against Bo Nickel, and when you stack stats up on a page and you try and compare these two guys, Bo Nickel's going to be a better wrestler than 99.9% of the guys that he fights in the UFC, and we've seen big-time wrestlers fight in the UFC and still get taken down. That has happened. Bo Nickel's one of those guys. He can power you down for it. You saw him kind of get caught in a situation where even Donovan Beard was on top, and it looked like he maybe could do some damage, but Nickel was able to pull out that choke from the bottom. So a wrestler getting it done on the bottom, that doesn't happen all the time. But Tresean Gore is one of those strikers that if he had Tiki Gosen in his ear yelling at him, he's the best striker in the world. Without Tiki, it's a little bit questionable, but for Gore out of ATT Atlanta, a really big opportunity to kind of slow down the hype, because if you look at it for Nickel in his last time out against Pickett, minus 1,800 favorite in a debut on a main card of a pay-per-view.
And if he keeps on looking like he has, you bring up the controversy with Pickett. If he gets another first-round submission, though, he is probably going to maintain that huge, heavy favorite position for a lot of his career until he does face guys who are going to make him go to his B and C game plans. And you brought it up. He can go for submissions off his back, but he has shown his flashes with his striking, too. He has a good overhand. He will commit a little bit too much to his power shots, but the thing is, no one really makes him just become a striker. No one forces him to just become a complete jiu-jitsu specialist.
That's not true, because in Bo Nickal's pro debut against Nolan, they're in the center of the cage, and his opponent that looked like Brett Cooper light, he goes like points down and has his Betch Kohea moment, and then he eats a giant shot and then another one and he gets knocked out. So yeah, he made him become a striker to his own detriment.
But that's why, like, Bo Nickal has shown us enough outside of his primary skill set to where he's not a fighter that I go, okay, if you just get rid of the wrestling, what else does he have? I'm not saying he's going to be able to grapple like Brian Ortega for 15 minutes or strike like a Francis Ngannou, but I do think some of those skill sets are starting to progress, and that's what I'll be really interested to see in this matchup against Tresean Gore, because if he goes out there and just gets another double single leg takedown and the fight's over, like, congrats, well, we're not going to have that much more to talk about the next time Bo Nickal goes out there. So I'm really curious to see if we are going to see more flashes of those B and C skills, because if he is able to continue to improve his wrestling, continue to improve his striking. We talked about middleweight last weekend, right? We had a main event between a guy who would never, well, Sean Strickland, who's been in so many main events, it's insane, but Magomedov, who is more of an unknown commodity, right? Bo Nickal, with the push that he's getting, if he keeps on looking impressive, I wouldn't be surprised if we see him move his way not only up the card, but up the division very rapidly.
Pro debut in 2022 for Nickal. He competed twice on Dana White's Contender Series main event in 2 of those cards. He got the win in the final episode. He gets the contract. We're off and running. For Tresean Gore, was a fan favorite on The Ultimate Fighter. A lot of people might be off that train, but they like that performance of the night bonus he had his last time out against Josh Frem. For Tresean Gore, a giant underdog in the matchup. We have a look at the Tapology votes. Get a little bit of an idea what the fans are thinking on this one. I'm going to say over under 95% Bo Nickal.
Probably over.
It is slightly over. 1,245 total votes, 96% Nickal, 77% by submission. For the 4% that have Gore, 59% by knockout. And for Bo Nickal, training for this one, we've seen him a lot at ATT, but it seems like from his Instagram, I know he went to like Puerto Rico and did a little bit of boxing. I know he's kind of been all over the map. Seems like he's been doing a lot of his training at Penn State, where he was the wrestling guy. So if you look at it for Nickal, an interesting test against Tresean Gore, whose wrestling's been all over the map throughout his career. It was considered a hallmark when he came on to The Ultimate Fighter. I do have Bo Nickal in the matchup, but when you look at a guy like Nickal from that southpaw stance, he throws a big overhand left and a big-time wind-up of a head kick from that shot. If you can get Tresean Gore to circle away and land some check hooks, it could be a good night for Tresean Gore, but I do think Nickal's going to be able to get the win.
I also have Bo Nickal, but I want to ask you this. Is there a next opponent in mind that you would like to see him go against? For me, I think Adolfo Vieira would be a really interesting matchup, right? You've got the BJJ versus the wrestling. I think it would make Bo Nickal work quite a bit on the mat, but I'm just curious, who would you like to see him go out there next? Because he is reaching that level where it's a bit of a shallow division, right? There's not a ton of new promising contenders. We saw Alex Pereira jump his way to the top of the division. I know he has some history with the champ, but still, I do think Bo Nickal's going to be able to work his way up quite rapidly.
Edmund Shabazian is the next one.
That'd be a fun
Edmund
fight,
Shabazian. So make it against Edmund Shabazian, a guy who's coming off a loss and a tough one at that. A big-time matchup in this one. Both of us going with the 3-time NCAA champ, Bo Nickal, to get the win. Some big-time fights in this card. You like middleweights? Robert Whittaker's fighting Dricus Du Plessis. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. Possible fight of the night contender in the main card at UFC 290 this weekend. While Jalen Turner, the Tarantula's 5-fight finish streak, may be over due to the constant wrestling attack of Poland's Mateusz Gamrot, Turner gets another opportunity at top flight competition when he takes on City Kickboxing's own The Hangman, Dan Hooker. And if you look at a fight like this, I mean, Jalen Turner is one of those guys, comes in on Contender Series, gets the fight against Vicente Luque at welterweight, does not win that fight, but Turner's really been able to show just a diverse skill set. And he's one of those interesting cases of a young guy without really the greatest level of experience getting the opportunity to train at Ruka Sport Down. It's an invite-only gym in Southern California. He's got that great boxing, really good power, really, really good submissions once it does get down to the mat. But the biggest thing that Turner has struggled with, and I talked about it earlier, the Mateusz Gamrot fight and then the fight that he had against Matt Frivola. He did struggle against the takedowns. Now, both those guys are ranked in the top 15 at this very moment, so it's no shame there. But for Jalen Turner, when you're breaking down a fight where Turner's taking on a fellow striker, those kicks from the outside, the uppercuts, the body shots when it gets in close, Jalen Turner will meet you with a knee up the middle as a big guy, and it's going to hurt. And these two guys, I don't know how Dan Hooker used to make featherweight. I don't know how he tried to make it against Arnold Allen. But these are some of the bigger lightweights you're going to find in this division.
Oh, they definitely are. And I think the range is going to be important, but I'll just throw my wrench in right now. Dan Hooker likes to wrestle when he's getting outstruck on the feet, and I oddly think that's going to be a really important part of this fight because Jalen Turner can get held down when he's not able to threaten with some of those submissions on that first touch because that's where he succeeds, and goodness, I made up a word. He succeeds because when you go for those takedowns and you do leave your neck in a poor position, how many times have we seen Jalen Turner's elbows immediately come up and we know that guillotine is cinched in? He has those defensive submissions in that back pocket, but Dan Hooker, and we saw it in the Nasrat Haqparast fight, we saw it in the Dustin Poirier fight and in the Paul Felder fight too, as those went late. 5-round fights, so a little bit different. But when Dan Hooker is starting to feel uncomfortable on the feet, which doesn't happen often, right? Like, Dan Hooker is an elite striker. He is pretty good defensively when he's not fighting guys who throw big power hooks around the side. But that's why I'm just going to kind of speak out loud here. That's why I have a hard time with this fight. Jalen Turner does the things well that should beat a guy like Dan Hooker at this stage of his career. He throws great power shots down the middle that should be able to hit him. But oddly enough, Dan Hooker gets hit more by hooks, I would say, than anything. We saw that not only in the Arnold Allen fight, go all the way back to when he was in featherweight before he moved up. All of his fights, a lot of the hooks when he is keeping his guard high can get around, which Jalen Turner is more straight shots, and Dan Hooker can become, I'm not saying he's a great wrestler, I'm not saying he's Khabib, but he will become a wrestler later on in fights, and I'll be curious to see if he will use that to try to win out on some moments, because if he does get hurt by a guy like Turner, maybe we could see Turner cinch up a submission after that, but Hooker's the guy we have seen go for those takedowns when he feels uncomfortable.
Hooker's tricky because the fight against Nasrat Haqparast, they threw it together on short notice, they had to go across the world, both of them to take the fight. Haqparast's mother just passed away before the fight, but to his credit, Dan Hooker did look really good with the takedowns that he was able to get in that one. He had the good takedowns against Dustin Poirier. He had one against Paul Felder, as you had mentioned. It was kind of a hallmark of something that he struggled against. In his fight against Yair Rodriguez, there was a 30-26 out there, a couple of 30-26s in that one. But one of the guys fighting for the title, and Dan Hooker's fighting Jalen Turner. So if you do look at it for Hooker, his best year, probably 2018. First round finishes of Gilbert Burns and Jim Miller. That stuff doesn't happen. It doesn't happen.
He had one of those really significant rises, though, and you can't say that about a lot of fighters. When Dan Hooker really was on his rise in the lightweight division, after he had his problems at 145 before he started to run into the Michael Chandlers of the world, the Dustin Poiriers of the world, like, Dan Hooker was on a significant rise to where every fight night card, he would be the main event, he would fight a guy who was further up in the rankings, and it really did feel like they were building towards something with Dan Hooker for a long time.
Random card that I just grabbed. I'm going to play the trump card. It's a rookie card of Cody Hoyer. Trump card right here. Jalen Turner training for this one at Ruka Sport 5 weeks ago on his Instagram. Flew over to Dubai to work everything with a thick boy, Khamzat Chimaev, getting ready for this one. So interesting stuff there for Jalen Turner in the matchup. He's a big favorite coming off of that loss to Mateusz Gamrot. If you consider the scorecards in that one, they were kind of all over the place. But on MMA decisions, he had 7 30-27s Gamrot, 16 29-28s Gamrot, 3 29-28 Turners.
And he landed some good shots.
Turner had the weird knockdown in the first round that looked like a slip on Gamrot, and Gamrot won the first round, and Gamrot was able to, I thought, win convincingly 2 of the 3 rounds. But if you look at it for Turner, I mean, the strikes are on point. We have a look at the Tapology votes. Surprised to us as they are to you. I'm going to say over under 72.5% Turner here.
I think they'll be under.
I think they're going to be under. They're over. So 1,195 total votes, 81% Turner, 62% by knockout. For the 19% that have Hooker, you've got 51% by decision, 35% by knockout. And Hooker in his last fight, he took on Claudio Puelles, who was all about that scoot, about that butt scoot. And if you look at it for him, like, Puelles kept trying to fish for the legs.
Those front kicks were gross.
He was trying Imanari rolls. He almost tried the Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje. I'm going to slide down here for this little base slide kick.
Throw sand, Tony. Throw sand.
Didn't work. But for Dan Hooker, yeah, the old teep to the breadbasket, that was the end against Puelles. But if you look back at Dan Hooker's last win, we talked about it a lot, the Nasrat Haqparast win where he went out and wrestled. The losses of late, Chandler, that earned Chandler a title shot. He eats the overhand shot.
Him and Poirier arguably had fight of the year.
The loss to Islam Makhachev where he gets taken down and submitted quickly. And then the loss to Arnold Allen where he also gets finished and he gets outstruck, but he depleted himself to 145. Dan Hooker's durability, questionable. I don't know how he lived through most of that Edson Barboza fight, but he did. That was his prize for beating Jim Miller and Gilbert Burns. Here's Edson Barboza. Have fun with that puzzle. But for me, I do Like Jalen Turner in the matchup. Obviously, I don't like the wrestling, but I think those power shots are going to win out. His knees up the middle, like I said, and his kicks are pretty darn good.
Dan Hooker, and this isn't a perfect comp, but Dan Hooker mindset-wise is a little bit like Jimmy Butler, right? Like, he might not be the best of the best, he might not represent the elite, but he is going to give it everything he's got, like you said in the Edson fight. Like, he even got Edson on the ground, completed a takedown, and was having some success after he'd eaten a ton of bad shots. Now, Edson got back up to the feet. He landed a lot more body kicks. You guys all know the story. But Dan Hooker's not going to beat himself, and I do think that has to be said. But I think this is another one, and we could say this 5 or 6 times on this card. I think it's going to be a really, really close fight and a very competitive fight. I think I favor Jalen Turner, but I think he's going to eat some big shots from Hooker. Hooker's not a guy who's just going to get hit once and fall down.
Both of us going with the tarantula Jalen Turner to get the win, bring it back to California. Some big-time fights left on this card, including the next one. Robert Whittaker's taking on Dricus Du Plessis. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it. Top 5 middleweights looking to punch their ticket to a title shot. Looking back at last weekend's main event, Sean Strickland finishing Abus Magomedov and trying to get their own ball rolling in Vegas. We have Still Knox, Dricus Du Plessis, the former EFC welterweight middleweight champ, the former KSW welterweight champ is Du Plessis. And while his coach said that he only had the 8% oxygen ability, Dricus getting the problems fixed. He's going to be taking on the Tough Smashes champ and former middleweight champ, Robert the Reaper Whittaker. And this is a big-time fight. And I can draw a lot of parallels out of some of the fighters that these two guys have faced in the past. But when you look at a guy like Dricus Du Plessis, we've been hip to the hype here at Fight Night Picks for a long time. We made a prediction video for Dricus Du Plessis, Jolton Luderbach, back with KSW. So if you don't think we've been there, we've been there. But when you look at a guy like Du Plessis, a constant win streak, that Luderbach win was after the Soldic loss, and he just got the ball rolling, goes back to EFC, gets a quick win, and then all of a sudden it's Maluko Perez, it's Trevin Giles, and we're off to the races. A fight of the night against Darren Till where he submitted him. His last time out against Derek Brunson. The weirdest end to a fight you've ever seen. Ground and pound, and then Du Plessis takes a breath and drinks a coffee, and then he lands one more shot, and Brunson's corner throws in the towel, which is awesome to see in MMA because you never see it. So good for Derek Brunson's corner to save him from himself, even though there was 1 second left in the round. For Dricus Du Plessis, we know the blitzes, we know the lineage, and we know that Robert Whittaker is going to offer him a tough test coming up this weekend.
Dricus Du Plessis is MMA's Jar Jar Binks. I've said this all the time and I stick by it. Because when you look at what he does, it might not be the most pristine. It might not be picture perfect to where he's always having a defensive shell up. When he's throwing one hand, the other one's always up. No, he is quite chaotic, but he thrives under that chaos, and I think that's going to be the important thing, because the one noticeable, I don't even want to say downgrade that Robert Whittaker's had, because I think we all understand he is one of the most skilled fighters in the UFC, not currently holding a title. The guy doesn't get as many finishes as he used to, though. And I do think it's a matter of, hey, at 185, you find a lot of 5-round fights. I don't think he changed his style when he was a champion, but we talked about that, right? You have to get used to fighting 5-round fights more than 3-round fights. And for Whittaker, he does have one of those styles that it doesn't really matter how many rounds he's fighting. He's going to have the output. He's going to have the power shots along with it. But we just haven't seen him go out there and mix. Listen, the head kick, did it drop Jared Cannonier? Yes, it did. But he didn't get the finish after that. Whereas earlier on in his career, we were seeing him getting finishes over the likes of like a Jauregui or even a Derek Brunson. So be curious to see what level of aggression Robert Whittaker does have, because he will fight moving backwards. We saw that again in the Derek Brunson fight. I think that Brunson fight's a really important one to bring up, because Brunson, especially at that point in his career, was the guy who would rush forward with reckless abandon and land really good power shots when he was fighting in. And technical for Derek Brunson might not be the greatest term, but you get what I mean. He was a guy who would rush forward and implement a lot more offense than defense. And if Robert Whittaker does kind of take himself back to that mindset of, hey, I'm going to have to move backwards, I'll plant my feet on my power shots, and maybe I can make Du Plessis pay for just moving in so much. But the thing is about Whittaker, and I'll bring up the Cannonier fight again, the third round of that fight, there was a moment that worried me. Jared Cannonier landed a jab on Robert Whittaker, and it stood him up. Now, I don't think Robert Whittaker has a bad chin by any means, but I do think he's been in a lot of really difficult fights. He's been hurt a couple of times. So I will be really curious to see if Du Plessis can get him backed up against the cage and start landing those big power shots in combination. Can Robert Whittaker really withstand those big flurries?
Dricus from South Africa, self-described, 33-0 at kickboxing with 30 knockouts, and he parlayed kickboxing into judo at 10, and then he went from that to fighting in big time I mean, just wrestling, 12-14, and then he got involved in
big time wrestling
K1, and from 15 to 18, he became a world champ in the old WAKO. So if you look at it from Dricus, you go, okay, this guy's got like a kickboxing type of lineage. We're going to see him go out there and really kind of work his fundamentals. He pressures forward. He walks heavy on his lead leg, and his back leg stays really light. Now, it opens up his own kicks, and he's one of those guys that can switch it up with his combinations. That's what you like at Rodriguez, because he'll rip the left hook to the body to come over top. He'll finish things with kicks, whereas Robert Whittaker, you're going to have a steady jab, similar to Rodriguez in the fact that heavy on the lead leg, he'll fight off the back foot or moving forward, but if he's moving forward, it's a lot more of the 2-3 with the head kick. That's kind of always been the combo from Whittaker. You saw that work to great avail when he fought Darren Till, especially at the end of that fight. But if you look at it for Dricus, against Till, bit of a lesser version. Against Brunson, bit of a lesser version. But for Whittaker, the fight that I went back and watched getting ready for this one was, you already mentioned it actually, the Jacare Souza fight. And Jacare, 5-time world champion Jiu-Jitsu. He was on a heater. He was a minus 240 favorite, even though he was 37 years old. That was a title eliminator. And Robert Whittaker went into that one and stuck to the fundamentals, and he wobbled Jacare with a jab. He finishes him with a right cross, but he had him in all sorts of trouble throughout that matchup. Got the win as the underdog, wins the belt, because at that point it was an interim title. Then it became the real McCoy. He beats Yoel Romero in a couple of fights, and then we're off to the races. Only the title's going away, and it's going to Adesanya. If you look at it for Whittaker, though, he shut out Marvin Vittoria's last time out, and that was his first 3-round fight in a meaningful amount of time. So now he's taking on Dricus du Plessis, who pressures a lot like Vittori in totally different ways. And if you look at it for Dricus, I talked about the fact that he has a judo pedigree. He wrestled a bit when he was a kid, but kickboxing is hallmark. That's kind of crazy because he tends to wrestle a lot in his fights, and that's kind of a big X factor in it.
I actually think Robert Whittaker's going to offensively wrestle in this matchup, and this is why. If du Plessis is just moving forward a lot with some of those flurries, Robert Whittaker's not great at controlling guys on the mat. We've seen it. Darren Till was able to pop back up. He will hold guys in the clinch. He's not great at just holding them down, but he does have that as a tool, and I do think if his striking is having a lot of success, he might at least try to feint that, because the one thing about Robert Whittaker, I don't love it, but he has had a lot of success with it. He'll feint the takedown just to get closer to his opponent, to land some of those dirty boxing uppercuts, and get closer to his opponent. Now, I think the closer he gets to du Plessis, the greater chance Dricus has to win this matchup, but this fight has a lot of layers to it, for Whittaker being one of those guys who is thought of as kind of like the 1B to Adesanya's 1A, because he's been at the top of the division for so long at this point.
Yeah, I mean, tough smashes. Ross Pearson was one of the coaches
at 170.
On that. Dricus du Plessis, I mean, he had a loss when he was 20 years old to 32-year-old Gareth McClellan. And that one was for an EFC title. A 4-0 du Plessis loses that fight to McClellan, and that is McClellan's shot to the UFC. And during that fight, the announcer said, "This is the best fighter on the continent, Gareth McClellan." And yeah, it didn't work out for him in the UFC, but Dricus is one of those guys. He was over-aggressive in that fight. He ended up getting swept, and he got submitted by McClellan. And his other loss is to Roberto Soldic, who I still think is great, even though he hasn't been good with one championship. You look at it for du Plessis, he was in Derek Brunson's half guard off a Brunson takedown. He swept out a half guard against Derek Brunson and then got into the guard in the first round. That stuff doesn't happen very often. So cool to see that out of du Plessis. Robert Whittaker, a giant favorite in the matchup. I mean, this sets up a great middleweight fight. Obviously, you know, you had Sean Strickland calling for a shot after the Magomedov knockout loss. Where are all the Magomedov people this week? Where did they go? I haven't seen them. Robert Whittaker, we have a look over on Topology. Surprised that's there to you with the fan vote. I'm going to say over under 85% Whittaker.
I think it'll be over.
The fans have been all over the place this week. Slightly over. 1,224 total votes. 87% Whittaker. 45% by decision. 48% by knockout. Robert Whittaker's last loss. His second to last fight. The second Adesanya fight. He lost that one by decision. I think Robert Whittaker does get it done in this matchup, but I think this is a way closer fight than what most people are going to tell you.
I do too, but I do think there's a world where even though saying that, Robert Whittaker could win like 30-27 and not be in a lot of danger, just because his footwork is so good, not only moving forwards, but moving backwards too with some of his evasiveness. He likes the front kick to maintain distance, and then he can set up his high kicks based off that front kick. I just like the totality of Robert Whittaker's game in this matchup, but I'll be curious though when we bring it up. Who's going to go for some of the wrestling between the two? Because they both have it in their games. But Robert Whittaker is one of the better defensive wrestlers we've really ever seen. Like, Yoel Romero couldn't keep this guy down on one ACL, so it's pretty difficult to take Whittaker down. I just really like the fight. And I'm curious to see, Is the winner going to get a title shot? Are they just going to kind of be stuck spinning their wheels in this division? Who knows, but I have Whittaker.
Both of us going with Gracie Grange, MMA's own Robert the Reaper Whittaker, the former champ, to get the win. I think it's going to be an awesome fight. Let us know down below in the comments section who you have. A couple of title fights up at the top. You're not going to want to miss them. Keep them locked in with Fight Night Picks. As we always say, let's get into it. Just when you thought that 4 fights ends a rivalry for the flyweight title, in steps another rivalry. We have the champion Brandon Moreno taking on and defending his belt in the 3rd installment versus Alexandre Pantoja, a man who knocked Moreno off The Ultimate Fighter Season 24, knocked him out of the UFC, and now he's looking to do the same with the belt. A big-time co-main event for this flyweight belt, and the first time since UFC 255 that it hasn't been Moreno, Figueiredo, or somebody else fighting for the real deal belt, because we know that Moreno, after the 3rd fight, he had to go down. He had to fight for the interim belt against Kai Kara-France, and in that rematch, Moreno had some trouble with the striking at the start, only to build his way back into the fight, land that great body kick, and get the win. Moreno then goes on to beat Figueiredo. He's out of the fight. He's moving up to bantamweight. He's sticking with flyweight. He can't get into a fight, can Divas and Figueiredo, but Alexandre Pantoja can. He hasn't fought since last year against Alex Perez, and he made it look easy. Easy against a great wrestler. He ducked it. He gets the back. He gets the submission win. So for Alexandre Pantoja, he was such an interesting guy coming onto that season of The Ultimate Fighter. He was the number 1 seed. He was the RFA flyweight champ. Brandon Moreno was, and I quote, the World Fighting Federation champion. Not World Wrestling Federation, World Fighting Federation. But Moreno, fresh-faced newcomer, 22 years old in that fight as the number 16 entrant. And in that one, they had one of the wildest first rounds that you're ever going to see. The second round was that much more. And I went back, I watched it obviously, but trying to score it, I thought it was really close. I thought Pantoja landed some more of the bigger shots because he had the great uppercuts. The body work was insane out of both of those guys. The body kicks from Moreno, the left hooks to the body from Pantoja. But you saw Pantoja kind of wear out Brandon Moreno, and on a tricky takedown attempt, he just slips the takedown attempt that he's going for, does Pantoja, gets it to the back, and then he ends up submitting Moreno. If you look at it in their next fight, they fought in the UFC. It was a big-time matchup. Moreno was ranked 7th. Pantoja was 12th. Pantoja gets the win, a 10-8 first round. He was all over Moreno, but then Moreno, in the top 10 off a loss, gets kicked out of the UFC for a bout with the LFA. It was kind of wild to see that.
I love this fight for so many reasons. A, it's wild that Brandon Moreno has fought 7 times against just 2 guys out there. Like, you probably shouldn't hate people that much in life, but Brandon Moreno just rivalries with everybody. What I love about this fight, though, is it's similar to why I love the rivalry against Figueiredo and Moreno. Both guys are so skilled in every aspect of MMA. You don't look at this matchup and think, oh, hey, one guy's going to have all the success in the world on the feet, the other guy's going to have all the success in the world on the mat, because both guys do blend their skill sets so well. And the interesting thing about Pantoja is Moreno can't take advantage of what I believe is his greatest skill set. And it's not his speed, it's not his fight IQ. There's a lot of things this guy does that are really, really high level. But Brandon Moreno is great at whatever you're good at. He is able to switch it up on you. And I know against Kai Kara-France, he was meeting him strike for strike. But in a lot of cases, if you are a very talented striker, Brandon Moreno's wrestling and grappling is good enough to go out there and win rounds, win moments, get submission wins. I like the Sergio Pettis matchup, and I know he lost that fight. I know I can hear you guys already, but Brandon Moreno had Sergio Pettis' back for 4.5 minutes in the first round of that fight. And it just shows that Moreno is so sticky in some of those positions that it's kind of easy to forget about them, because we've really only seen him strike through it a lot of that rivalry with Figueiredo. I know there was a submission, but for a lot of that, it was contested on the feet with those great boxing combinations. The Kai Kara-France, both those fights, a lot of that was on the feet. So I think with Moreno, it is easy to kind of get caught up in that rivalry with Figueiredo and kind of forget about everything this guy can do with his skill set. But again, for Pantoja, well, okay, let's say Pantoja's having success in the feet. You can't just take the guy down. It's not some easy proposition because his submissions are at such a high level. And what I like about Pantoja, too, is we bring it up every week. He's not just some pinned down look at the ref. He's going to threaten with sweeps. He's going to threaten with trying to take your back. His fight against Askar Askarov, he hit one of the most beautiful transitions you will ever see. He somehow got, like, between the legs of Askar Askarov and took his back. It was just beautiful, and it shows how skilled both these guys really are.
And if you consider it, both guys, bonuses all over the place. Pantoja, fight of the night against Figueiredo, didn't win that fight, but he still gets that done. You look at the performance bonuses, Schnell, Royval, and I mean, you consider for Pantoja, even in his last loss, being Askar Askarov, there were things that you could point to.
Fight.
100% it was. Now, do we get a tentative version of Pantoja that's feeling it out, like when he fought Manel Kopp? Do we get that all-in, balls-out type of version? Pantoja's one of those guys, too. There's a lot of MMA math that somebody could play, but at the end of the day, somebody might say, well, the fight that they had on The Ultimate Fighter, that doesn't really count. You watch the fight, we're talking about it, it's the third installment, so it did really happen because it kicked Moreno off the show. But if you consider it for a guy like Pantoja, he has an early career loss to Jussier Formiga that he then went on to train with at American Top Team. You're lucky that Pantoja didn't have to fight Zhaga Zhumagulov. They trained together. I mean, Coconut Head would have been a problem. Maybe not the last version of him. But for a guy like Pantoja, all of the opponents, all of the similarities, it boils down to this. Pantoja's shown not giant leaps and bounds of growth throughout his UFC career.
He's just been good.
He looks like the same guy that we had from the RFA. And what happened was Pantoja lost to a middle-of-the-pack fighter in the Ultimate Fighter, who then lost to Tim Elliott. Elliott gets the title shot against Demetrius Johnson, wins the first round, loses all the other rounds. But you look at a guy, like Pantoja and Moreno. They fight in the opening fight, number 1, number 16. Screw it. They both get contracts into the UFC off of that. And we've seen marked improvements from Brandon Moreno, who could, at that time, and he still can, rely on his toughness, get by with his striking, implement his grappling. Moreno's tightened everything up. And you saw it from Entram to becoming the champ, to going to glory, to, that glory thing's got to end. And in Moreno's last fight, not the Kai Kara-France fight, because in that fight, that was a Kraus fight, but for Moreno's last time out against Figueiredo in the fourth fight, Saif Saud is in the corner, and Moreno looked like a man possessed. So if you look at the improvements that you're going to make, he spends so much time kind of cross-training at different gyms, but if he sets up the home base at the UFC PI in Vegas, brings people in. You always see the same team. Macio Fullen, you see Marcelo Rojo there out of Entram training with Brandon Moreno. I mean, rising tide lifts all boats, but not really in that case. But you have a lot of Entram gym fighters on this card. We look at this, and it's not your regular everyday trilogy bout where it's tied. One guy's up, but it is still such a close fight. And in this installment, even though Pantoja is 2-0, Moreno is a 2-1 favorite in the matchup, if not more. So we have a look at the topology votes. I mean, it really is surprising.
Just one last thing I want to say. Do you know what I liked about Pantoja in their second fight? He made him pay for a lot of that awkward movement that Brandon Moreno does like to do on the back foot. Pantoja would really make him pay for when he was leaning on those odd angles. So 2 big points that I'm going to focus on in this fight. Brandon Moreno is going to have to weaponize the 4th and the 5th round. I do expect it to go there. I don't think either guy's going to get a finish just because of how skilled they are at this stage of their career. I think it's going to be tough ass to say, Brandon Moreno goes out there and TKOs Pantoja or submits them, and same vice versa. So I really do think those 2 last rounds are going to be important for Moreno, because I agree with you. Not only has he been able to really gain in a lot of his skill sets, but that's the other thing that he has a ton of experience in now is 5-round fights and a 5-round atmosphere. So I think that 4th and 5th round of this fight does make it there. It's going to be really important for the Moreno camp.
And if you look at a guy like Pantoja, some fights it's tentative, but most fights he sees red from the opening bell, and that could be something that gets him caught in this one, where Brandon Moreno is more pitter-patter, pick your shots on the outside, let her Kenny it, and get the win. So we do have a look at that topology vote. Surprised us, it is to you. I'm going to say over under 70% Moreno in this one.
I'll say over.
And it's under. So 1,218 total votes, 65% Moreno, 67% by decision for the 35% that have Pantoja, 50% by submission. So Matt, I've wanted this fight since Figueiredo was a thing. Like, I've wanted to see this trilogy so badly. And I have a hard time trying to make the pick, but I think it's going to be an amazing fight while it lasts.
I think it is going to be a really good fight. I do worry about Moreno's susceptibility to getting hit by some big power shots. We saw Kai Kara-France able to get through on some moments. And of course, Figueiredo was able to drop him numerous times throughout all 4 of their fights. The difference is, though, I don't know if Pantoja, after some of those big flurries, is going to have enough, not left in the tank. I don't think that's the right way of saying it. But just, if he's going to have enough flurries throughout a 5-round fight to make up for the activity of a guy like Brandon Moreno. Because even if you do hurt him with a big shot, he's going to land 40 significant strikes of his own, which is probably going to make that round close. So then you're going to have to do quite a bit more outside of the big knockdown. I think Pantoja's going to make it a really close fight, but I do just slightly edge Brandon Moreno. I like the Tapology votes, put it that way. 65% of me thinks Moreno's going to win, but there's a 35% chance that thinks Pantoja's a great chance.
The 35% likes Pantoja because of the leg kicks, and it was a big weapon in the first fight between these two guys and limited the movement of Moreno. It was a big one in the second fight, and when you watch Pantoja fight and you go down through some of these performances that he's been able to have, the leg kick has been the biggest part of his game, and it really does stifle a lot of the offense of his opponents, so it stops a lot of the boxing. And if you look at it, I mean, I think it's awesome that Moreno has gotten continually better, and I say, you know, like you look at it, rising tide lifts all boats. It's kind of one of those things like the 2013 smash hit by Canadian Sunreal. Who's that there? Everywhere we go.
Brandon Moreno.
Yeah, it's Brandon Moreno, and he just gets it done everywhere he goes. And Sunreal, what happened?
Well, Brandon Moreno
he's like the Gavin Tucker of music.
He hasn't just improved on one area of his game. It's not like, oh, Moreno now has a black belt in jiu-jitsu or anything. It's just everything has just progressively improved and improved and improved. He does seem to really pick up on that cross-training because there's some fighters we talk about, hey, they'll be at this gym for a couple camps, they'll travel to another gym for a couple camps, and they might not really catch on with any one philosophy, so it doesn't help them a lot. Whereas Brandon Moreno, like you said, it is much more of kind of an open training environment. He trains with a lot of his kind of former camp members and other ones too. So I think this fight's going to be incredible. I think this is going to be fight of the night, which is wild to say because our next matchup is between Volkanovski and Yair Rodriguez.
We're split on the pick. Let us know down below in the comment section who you have. I'm going with Alexandre Pantoja. Matt's got Brandon Moreno. And it's time for that main event. Featherweight title on the line. Volkanovski taking on Rodriguez. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say.
Let's get into it.
They're calling him the featherweight GOAT. Coming up this weekend at featherweight, we have the titles on the line. Yair Rodriguez looking to unify the belt. He is the interim champ. He's taking on the great. It's Alexander Volkanovski. As always, one half of your hosting duo, Craig Allen, Twitter and Instagram at Craig Allen FNP. With me to my left, to your right, respective socials, Matt Allen FNP. And for both of these guys, they each competed at UFC 284. Rodriguez getting that win over Josh Emmett. It was a surprise submission win. And if you look at it for Alexander Volkanovski, he ended up losing to Islam Makhachev in a close fight at lightweight. So really able to push some buttons in that one, though he did struggle in some of the grappling. I can already see it out there right now. Like a lot of people so excited about this matchup, but they're still left with that Yair Rodriguez fight against Frankie Edgar, the loss that he has to Max Holloway. Don't kid yourselves, though. He's much improved since the Edgar fight, and that Max Holloway fight, a lot closer than people think. So if you really go back and you break it down, you might play MMA math and say, wow, Holloway lost 3 fights handily to Volkanovski. Only the last one was really handily. One of them he had a shot, or at least a bit of an inkling that maybe he had won. But if you look at it for a guy in Volkanovski, I mean, hasn't lost in years in this weight class. He's just continued to put performance after performance together. And if you really do consider it in terms of featherweight all-timers, Jose Aldo set the bar at featherweight title wins with 8. But Volkanovski right now tied with Holloway at 5. So it's crazy to see that for Volkanovski. He continues to build his name. And I know only in a few short months he'll be 35. But he still looks like he's got more in the tank in this weight class.
More in the tank might be a stretch to go just because he already is the pound-for-pound #1 fighter for most people in the UFC. I mean, it's him and Islam. They basically fought to a draw.
Jon Jones is #1.
Jon Jones is, like, not active enough.
No, just by the numbers.
Sure, whatever, if you really want to cut me off for that. But for Volkanovski, skill-wise, there's nobody out there who's more skilled than he is pound-for-pound-wise. He's someone who can get it done on the feet. And what I love about Volkanovski, too, is it's not just his physical acumen and what he can do. The guy's extremely smart with his in-ring IQ. What I really like about Volkanovski is he's going to find that one little area of your game that he has an advantage over you with, and he's going to exploit it. And what I really like is the third Max Holloway fight really showcases that. He made that fight more about hand speed than anything else, because Max Holloway has good feet, right? He can get in, hit you with his shots, get out. But Volkanovski was able to use the leg kicks to make Holloway a more stationary target, and then get on the inside and use his faster hands to really bust up the face of Max Holloway. Now, Yair's a guy who I'm really curious to see if Volkanovski has that same speed advantage against, because Yair might be more of a kicker than he is a puncher, but the boxing has made big improvements throughout his UFC tenure. I think the Max Holloway fight definitely shows that, even though he was on the losing end. But for Yair, I do think he can have success on the feet, mainly because of his speed. Volkanovski, I know he fought at 150 155. He's a thick guy at 145, but he doesn't have the biggest frame in the division. So I do think he's going to have to get close to Yair at some point, and that's a buzzsaw you got to get through at some point, because Yair not only throws a lot of kicks, they're from weird angles, he'll set them up with his boxing. He's a really difficult fighter to move forwards on, and exactly, he's implemented many more elbows and knees into his game too, so it's not as simple as, oh, if I just get close to Yair, he becomes a much easier fighter to deal with, because now he's got BJJ off his back. It might not be the highest level of all time, but it's good enough to get you a submission win, a UFC title fight, and like you bring up, he's got the elbows and he's got the knees now to deal with guys who are going to try to collapse the range. It's just a big ask for Yair, because now he's not only going to have to focus on the elbows, the kicks and everything, he's going to have to worry about the takedown defense from a guy like Volkanovski too, because if Volkanovski is so close, not only can he strike, he can just reach for those legs a lot easier.
And it's going to be interesting too, because for Rodriguez, I mean, he won the Ultimate Fighter Latin America Season 1. He debuted at UFC 180. That was a Verdum card. Everybody likes those. Verdum, Velasquez. But if you look at it for a guy in Yair Rodriguez, out of his 13 fights in the UFC, bonus eligible in 12 because one's a no contest, he's earned 9 bonuses so far in the UFC. And one of those, the double bonus, UFC Denver, Korean Zombie, 25th anniversary. Crazy to see. But for Rodriguez, the last 2 wins, the Josh Emmett fight, and then if you consider it as well, the win over Brian Ortega, you're beating former top guys. And at the time, I mean, if you look at it for the Brian Ortega one, it was kind of, it was sad to see because of the shoulder injury, but you still get the win there. You get to keep that on your mantle. You get to like that on Twitter, and then people go through your Twitter likes, and they really worry about Brian Ortega, my guy. Yikes! But for Yair Rodriguez, what was the hallmark of his game his last time out that wasn't the submission? It was those kicks to the body. They were disgusting. So working those in against a smaller opponent, Josh Emmett, possible to do that against a guy like Volkanovski. And for this camp for Volkanovski, the big story going into the fight against Makhachev seemed to be Tiger Muay Thai, Bang Tao, like getting ready with the all-time kind of training partners over there instead of just focusing down and hunkering down in Australia. For this one, it seems like he's well aligned with Joe Lopez to get ready at freestyle fighting. Obviously, you get that city kickboxing connection, and you have a big-time city kickboxer on this card and Dan Hooker on the main card. But when I look at this one, you really boil it down and make it at its simplest. Will we get to see the grappling out of Volkanovski? Will we get to see some of those defenses out of Rodriguez? Because we've seen Rodriguez go strike for strike against good strikers and fare quite well in the UFC.
We definitely have. The other thing I want to bring up too is, what happened to Roy Jones Jr. when he fought John Ruiz at heavyweight? He moved back down, and he wasn't as good when he moved back down. Now, for Volkanovski, he didn't make as exaggerated of a weight improvement, I guess, his last time out. He only moved up 9 pounds, and he didn't really put on a crazy amount of mass or anything. But I do think that's a point that has to be brought up. Volkanovski at 34 now, he's been in a lot of, I wouldn't say he's taken a ton of damage. The Chad Mendes fight, he got hit a little bit. The Holloway trilogy, it's not like he got away scot-free, but for the most part, he's not a fighter you really worry about in those terms. But I think it's a fair point to bring up. When you've been in as many difficult fights as he has, and you are the age that he's in, moving back down in weight, I think those are fair question marks to bring up. But the last fight I want to bring up for Volkanovski is, I think he's going to fight this fight like he fought JBC, Jeremy Kennedy.
Just straight for the takedown.
I don't think Volkanovski's going to want to play around with Yair Rodriguez on the feet, and this is why I say that. I think Volkanovski respects Max Holloway too much to go out there and play with Yair Rodriguez on the feet. And I know Max Holloway beat him, but there's not a lot of guys in the world who can eat a lot of the shots and the combinations that Yair was able to land in that fight, even the elbows like you bring up. So I don't think this is going to be a fight where, Volkanovski kind of riding that momentum, oddly enough to say, off his loss, is going to go in there and wash Yair, because Yair just has the counter to a lot of what Volkanovski does well.
Rodriguez can go out there and play the straight game, and we've seen Volkanovski go out and kind of switch stances in his fights and have success from both stances, but for Rodriguez, 57 leg kicks against Max Holloway over the 5 rounds. It's crazy to see that for him. But Rodriguez, on the flip side, if you want to talk takedown defense, 63% in the UFC. He's been taken down by Emmett, Ortega, Holloway, Stevens, Edgar, Caceres, Feely, Hooker, and Charles Rosa. Got 5 of them in a split decision win for Yair Rodriguez. So the guys, they have taken him down, but he's also 10-2 with a no contest in the UFC. Now, Alexander Volkanovski is a pretty darn big favorite in the matchup. We threw this one out there to you. YouTube community tab. You guys have more votes than the Topology voters. Matt, 1,200 total votes. You can't see this one. I'm going to say over, under. Well, I saw it, so it's not fair. 77% going with Alexander Volkanovski to get the win in the fight. Your comments, 29 of them already. We got one from Sean saying, love Volk, but I think Yair catches him with head kick KO. His speed going to be a problem. How short Volk is, Yair going to get that kick to his head awfully quick. We also have some comments from the Rodentry Resistance. Yair is a dangerous fight for anyone in the division. It's impossible not to have Volk as the favorite against any 145er, though the man has proven to be a featherweight GOAT. And then we also have one, I'll go with the Lone Wolf. I hope Volk wins, but Yair is game, man. He's game, man. I still think Jose Aldo is the featherweight GOAT. And I think it's crazy to say consensus, because if it's a consensus, everybody has to agree. But for me, the WEC, the UFC, it is Jose Aldo. But if Volkanovski gets on over Yair Rodriguez, it continues to build that up. And when you look at a fight like this, I do like the complete skill set out of Volkanovski, even though Rodriguez keeps getting better, and he's training at Valley Flow Striking for this one, where I'm sure Bilal Muhammad's a giant asset to have in the Chicago area to get ready for a fight like this, but I still do go back to Volkanovski in the pick.
Volkanovski is one of the better fighters of all time. I think that's fair to say. Whether you have him at 145 as the GOAT or not, it's him, Max Holler, or Jose Aldo. Three of the greatest fighters of all time. So Volkanovski is in that rare era at this point in his career, but that's when things get dangerous, right? You become complacent. You aren't kind of the fired up non-champion that you once were.
Kamaru Usman.
Usman was old, though, Usman was getting up there anyways.
Volkanovski's not young.
My point is, Yair Rodriguez has a lot of the skills that I do think can cause Volkanovski issues, but I bring up the JBC fight for a reason. Volkanovski not only has great ground and pound, he has great top pressure too, and I think he's going to be able to hold Yair down, avoid some of those bigger submission threats, but this fight for Volkanovski, remember the movie The Hurt Locker? That was a good movie, okay? Jeremy Renner's diffusing bombs. That's what it's like to fight somebody like Yair Rodriguez. If you make any little mistake, it's over. He has that kind of striking. He has that kind of BJJ, or at least he perceived as at this stage of his career. But how do you defuse a bomb? You don't be big and strong, you just be really smart. And that's what Alexander Volkanovski is at this stage of his career. I think that is his one big X factor. Not only is he incredibly well-rounded, but his X factor is his fight IQ. And that's something that you could be 34, you could be 44. That doesn't really just fade overnight.
No hair, don't care. Both of us going with the great Alexander Volkanovski in the matchup. And Matt, this is an interesting week because it's International Fight Week. You have a fighter on the prelims. I was going to say main card, but it's a curtain jerker to the main card. Robbie Lawler, he will be honored, canonized in the Hall of Fame 2023 fight wing for his fight at UFC 189 against Rory McDonald. It's a weird week with Fight Night picks because it was blue hair, don't care, but thank goodness it washed it. It took me 5 shampoos to wash that out. What I will say though is I'm away all week, so if there's changes to the fights, tough luck on this week only. We'll be back as scheduled for next weekend, but there will be no question mark kicks on Saturday. So what we need you to do is toss a like on this video, and if you want to hit up the super thanks to thank us for that great work, make sure you do. We'll do our best to respond to those ones as well. You guys are doing a great job out there with Fight Night Picks. We really appreciate all of your support. At Fight Night Picks, Twitter and Instagram, at Craig Allen FNP, at Matt Allen FNP. We know we're fired up for the fights, and we hope you are as well. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it.